Chapter 617. Sorry, this is the last chapter of the third volume, so it's a little hard to write. I wrote too much, so it's a little late. Sorry. Sang Sang was the only one on the portraits in the streets, but the Buddhism and Taoism sects knew that Ning Ke was with Sang Sang, and they also knew about the conspicuous black horse carriage that could not be disguised. The black horse carriage was Yen Sei's legacy. The Buddhism and Taoism sects must have thought that he would not give it up. He took advantage of this and left the big black horse in the carriage outside the city, while he took Sang Sang into the city. He chose to hide in Chaoyang City temporarily because he wanted to wait for eldest brother here. Moreover, Sang Sang's illness kept worsening, and he was worried that Sang Sang would not be able to hold on if he had to fight to the end. Even if he could not wait for eldest brother, he had to come to Chaoyang City, because he believed that it was always dark under the lamp, and he believed in his ability to hide. He also hoped that the Buddhist temple here could help Sang Sang get better. Walking in Chaoyang City with Sang Sang on his back, Ning Ke did not take long to find his target. It was a shabby courtyard not far from the Yueluan Kingdom's palace. Standing in the courtyard, one could see the famous White Tower Temple, but it was located in a noisy, low-class street, which was convenient for hiding. The most important and decisive reason why he chose this small courtyard was because it was extremely dilapidated. The door was covered in dust, and it was obvious that no one had lived in it for a long time. Furthermore, it was so quiet that it was like a haunted house. Ning Ke did not inquire about the story of the courtyard, because any connection with others might lead to unexpected results. He directly sneaked into the government office of Chaoyang City, and secretly searched the case files. As he had expected, an extremely bloody massacre happened in the courtyard last year. The owner of the courtyard died in the massacre, and his relatives who were qualified to inherit the courtyard, were obsessed with Buddhism and did not want to take over the sinful courtyard. Therefore, the courtyard was taken back by the Yueluan Kingdom, but still no one was willing to buy or rent it. Even the greedy officials and monks had no interest in the courtyard. Of course, Ning Ke would not rent a small courtyard. When dusk fell, he carried Sang Sang on his back and easily jumped into the small courtyard from the broken wall on the back street. He passed through the main hall and came to the bedroom in the backyard. Along the way, the twilight was dim and extremely quiet. The old bricks on the ground and the walls were still stained with dark old blood stains, causing it to seem extremely gloomy. Not to mention ordinary people, even a butcher who had seen blood would probably feel his scalp go numb. It was no wonder that everyone avoided this house and would rather abandon it than accept it. Ning Ke and Sang Sang had seen countless dead people since they were young, and they had seen much more gruesome scenes than this. However, they showed no fear at all, not even the slightest change of expression. There was no blood stain in the bedroom, only a dusty bed and a table. After a moment of silence, he walked out of the small courtyard again. When he came back, he held several quilts in his arms and plastering for carpentry in his hand. After a simple cleaning, Ning Ke spread the thick and soft quilt on the ground and put a new pillow on it. Then he dug up the abandoned well in the courtyard and fetched water to mix the ash. He pasted all the cracks on the windows of the woodshed flat and tight without leaving a gap. Then he hung a thick black cloth on the windows and the door. It was already dark. He reached out to hang down the two black cloths, then walked out of the room and said, "Done?" He heard the slight sound of a fire in the room. He carefully observed and found that no light leaked out, so he nodded. Many years ago, he took Sang Sang to hunt in Min Mountain and squatted in the snow to ambush wild boars. Wild boars were particularly sensitive to light and human smells. The temporary squatting spot he built in the snow could be tightly sealed without a trace of light and his own smell. Now it was not difficult to use it to deal with these things. The night was dark and the small courtyard was still gloomy. No one dared to approach it. Even if they did, they would only see the same shabby scene as before. There was no trace of anyone who had been here. The Buddhism sect was looking for the black horse carriage everywhere, trying to find Ning Ke and Sang Sang. Numerous powerhouses from Haoyan Taoism were lying in ambush in the Pamir Mountains, which was the only route to the Tang Empire. Who would have thought that the daughter of Yama was in a small courtyard so close to the White Tower Temple? A black crow landed on a tree in the courtyard and looked up at the stars. Sang Sang's portrait was everywhere in Chaoyang City. People gathered in front of every Buddhist temple. The monks were telling the legend of the underworld, the last words of Buddha, and the story of the daughter of Yama. The people of Yueluan Kingdom had complicated expressions. Some were frightened and some were sad and angry. The Buddhist teaching to not be angry was all forgotten. Gradually the crowd became excited. People waved their fists and said that they would find the daughter of Yama and burn her to death. Ning Ke walked on the street. The discussion and anger of the crowd, as well as the most vicious curses against Sang Sang, did not affect him at all. It did not take long for him to arrive at the ceremony hotel. The envoy of the Tang Empire to the Yueluan Kingdom was in the ceremony hotel. He did not enter the ceremony hotel. Instead, he stood in a slightly quieter back alley and listened attentively to the movements in the courtyard wall before deciding what to do. This is not self-preservation. It's not surrender. It's right or wrong. The Tang Empire is the leader of the world. Of course, we don't care about the pressure from the Yueluan Kingdom. Even the West Hill Divine Palace can't make us retreat. But I can't watch the world perish like this. This is the responsibility that the Tang Empire should bear. Ning Ke stood quietly in the alley outside the wall and listened for a while. This was the most useful piece of information he heard. The person who spoke was the envoy of the Tang Empire to the Yueluan Kingdom. He slowly lowered his head and turned to leave. Sang Sang looked at the expression on his face and knew that the situation was not good. She reached out and held his hand. Ning Ke smiled bitterly and said, "I'm fine. I was just a little surprised to hear something." Sang Sang asked, "What is it?" Ning Ke said, "Guess how long it has been since we left the Lank Temple?" Sang Sang thought for a while and said, "At least a month." "Wrong, it's a year." Ning Ke touched her slightly cold face and said, "A year has passed unknowingly. Then I still have the patience to endure another half a year. Tomorrow I will take you to the White Tower Temple to read the Buddhist scriptures." The first half of his and Sang Sang's lives were extremely difficult, even miserable. But it was also those difficult days that made them who they were now. They had courage, perseverance, indifference and patience that ordinary people could not imagine. 10 years ago, deep in the snow-covered Min Mountain, Ning Ke carried Sang Sang on his back and squatted in the snow cellar to kill a wild boar. Unexpectedly, a winter bear that was awakened unexpectedly appeared. After the bear killed the wild boar and ate its fill, it seemed to notice that there was still food nearby and refused to leave. It stayed near the snow cellar for a few days, relying on the wild boar's carcass. At that time, Ning Ke was not strong enough, and Sang Sang was only a 6-year-old girl. It was impossible for them to defeat a greedy winter bear. They had no other choice but to hide in the snow cellar and pray. Their prayers to Haotian would never be answered, but waiting beyond the endurance of ordinary people could always be exchanged for success. In the end, the winter bear could not resist the hunger and left bitterly. When Ning Ke climbed out of the snow cellar with the dying Sang Sang on his back, they had stayed in the snow cellar for 4 days and 4 nights. In that case he and Sang Sang could survive. Why couldn't they survive now? Ning Ke looked out of the window at the gradually thinning autumn sky and the thickening autumn clouds and thought silently. On the tree in the small courtyard, the black crow cawed, which was very unpleasant to hear. Ning Ke and Sang Sang disappeared from the world again. They had disappeared for a whole year, but at that time the Buddhism and Taoism sects guessed that they were either dead or in the chessboard world left by Buddha. No one was shocked when they could not find any trace of them, nor did they think it was incredible. However, now that they had left the chessboard world of Buddha and returned to the human world, they disappeared again. The powerhouses of the Buddhism and Taoism sects and countless people in the world tried all methods but could not find any trace of them. They could not help but be shocked and vigilant to the extreme. After all, many people were even monitoring the academy now. An old monk slowly walked out of the giant sinkhole in the depths of the western wilderness and walked forward. The old monk wore a bamboo hat, obscuring his face. He held a monk's staff in his hand and walked very slowly. It was not a deliberate slowness to appear calm and indifferent. Instead, it was as if his feet were tightly connected to the desolate and boundless earth. Every step he took was naturally slow and difficult. The monk's staff in his hand kept tapping on the ground, as if he was looking for something or someone in the wilderness. However, he walked so slowly, who could he find? However, the moment he walked out of the giant sinkhole, he seemed to find something and said, "The palace?" A distant bell rang in the yellow temple between the giant peaks in the center of the giant sinkhole. In the right king's palace thousands of miles away, a dusty scholar looked at Chanyu and a dozen palace priests who were on guard. He bowed slightly and said, "May I ask if you have seen my younger brother?" More than 10 miles away, the vice monk of the Hall of Respect of Shenkong Temple rushed to the palace with 30 ascetic monks. The old monk continued to walk slowly. After walking for half a day, he stopped and said, "Liuguan?" The bell rang again in the yellow temple between the giant peaks in the center of the giant sinkhole. The scholar appeared in Liuguan, a famous trading center at the edge of the wilderness. 1,000 grassland cavalries and several Yueluan kingdom cavalries received military orders and galloped to Liuguan. The old monk continued to walk. One day later he stopped and said another place. The president of the Hall of Respect of Shenkong Temple quietly looked at the scholar under the poplar tree not far away. Eldest brother looked at the thick bark of the poplar tree and understood what had happened. Regardless of the danger of falling into a lower state, he used the distanceless ability to search for his youngest brother's traces everywhere, while the Buddhism and Taoism sects sent people to follow him. Even if he found Ning Ke, he would not be able to take him away quietly. He would have to face the continuous attacks of the Buddhism and Taoism sections. No cultivator could keep up with the limitless state and accurately find him every time. Two conditions must be met at the same time. The other party must have enough powerhouses or troops and be prepared near all the places he could reach. At the same time, the other party must be able to know where he was in the shortest time possible. Logically speaking, it was impossible to fulfill these two conditions at the same time. However, when the entire human world was searching for Sang Sang, and when the Buddhist and Taoist sects joined hands with the entire secular world, they could really send out a sufficient number of experts or armies, and someone could fulfill the second condition. Eldest brother looked gentle and dull, but he was actually very smart. It only took him a short time to understand everything and confirm his guess. The chief preaching monk of Shenkong Temple had finally come to the human world. He looked at Chi Mei and smiled slightly. He sat down against the poplar tree and took out the old book from his waist to read. There was no pond beside him to scoop water with, but he still looked calm. Since the Buddhism and Taoism sects tried to determine the location of Ning Ke and Sang Sang through him, he decided to do nothing but read, eat and sleep from this moment on. Doing nothing was the best way to hide. On the contrary, the more you tried to hide, the easier it would be for you to be exposed. Eldest senior brother did not understand this principle, but he acted according to his heart's desire and naturally made the best choice. Ning Ke had a lot of experience in hiding and escaping. He understood this and did the same. Other than taking Sang Sang to various Buddhist temples to read scriptures and cure diseases, he never left the small courtyard or even went to find eldest brother. Sang Sang's illness was slightly better, or it did not get worse for the time being. She was still listless and fell into a deep sleep just after noon. Ning Ke sat by the bed and began to read. This book was the handwritten notes of Buddha in the Lank Temple. He arranged the words of the Ming hand scroll of the tomes of arcane and the side notes of Buddha in order to make it easier to read. However, he still could not understand more at that time. These days, Ning Ke took Sang Sang to several Buddhist temples and vaguely understood something. So he read the notes again and frowned slightly. He said to himself, "The night comes because of the moon. Doesn't this mean that the cause and effect are reversed? The shadow of the night falls on the moon and can no longer be washed away. What does this mean?" He looked at Sang Sang, who was sleeping soundly. He looked at her pale little face and reached out to touch it. He thought that the shadow of the night mentioned in the Ming hand scroll was naturally the daughter of Yama, which was Sang Sang. The shadow of the night falls on the moon and can no longer be washed away. From the literal meaning and the current situation, the moon naturally referred to himself. In the whole world he was indeed the only one who had seen the moon. Ning Ke was thoughtful and seemed to understand something, but he was still confused. A few unpleasant cawing sounds came from outside the window. He made sure that no one was outside and pushed the door to the courtyard. Looking at the black crows on the tree, he frowned slightly. On the first night he came to the small courtyard, a crow flew over. In the following days, a black crow flew over every day. Gradually, there were more and more black crows, and the branches were almost unable to bear their weight. No matter how he looked at it, there was something strange about it. He looked up at the sky and found that there were more and more clouds above Chaoyang City. Those clouds had been slowly approaching and merging into a thick cloud layer that covered the sky. As the cloud layer thickened, people in the city finally felt a trace of coldness. Autumn was finally coming to an end. For Ning Ke and Sang Sang, the autumn of the previous year and this year were connected. In these two autumns, too many things had happened to them. How could they not feel sad? Volume 3, The End of Eventful Times. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 6:18. The wind and snow were not raging and the road was not blocked. Accompanied by the slowly falling snowflakes, an old monk with a monk's staff and a bamboo hat slowly walked out of the wilderness. He entered the Ueluan kingdom and walked towards a low mountain peak. The old monk walked very slowly, slower than the falling snowflakes and even slower than the melting snow. The soles of his straw sandals seemed to be glued to the ground. When he lifted his feet, it seemed like he was pulling up the entire ground, so every step he took was very difficult. When he walked on the snow, the layer of snow was pulled up. When he walked on the muddy ground, the black muddy ground was pulled up. When he walked on the bluestone mountain path, the stone surface was pulled up. The mountain path that was covered in light snow seemed unchanged, but in fact the structure deep inside the snow was constantly tearing, making extremely faint rustling sounds that humans could not hear. Even the entire mountain peak was groaning along with the old monk's footsteps. The animals hiding in the depths of the mountains to avoid the winter could hear the sound. The wolves licking their dirty fur raised their heads in alarm. The magpies hiding in their nests looked up in horror into the distance. The lynx that was trying to chew through the skin of a frozen deer let out a shrill scream. The old monk walked to the top of the mountain and looked towards the south. 10 miles south of the mountain peak, the snow stopped. Most of the sky in the Ueluan Kingdom was devoid of snow clouds. However, the capital of the Ueluan Kingdom, Chaoyang City, was covered by thick clouds. Looking at it from 1,000 miles away, the thick cloud was like a lonely flower in the boundless Buddhist kingdom. The old monk looked at the cloud in silence. The shadow of the bamboo hat did not cover his aged face. A very complicated expression slowly appeared on his face. Then he tightened his grip on the monk's staff and gently inserted it into the rock beside him. He looked into the distance and said, "Man is under the cloud." When the staff came into contact with the rocks on the peak, it was like a hot knife stabbing into a pile of snow. Without a sound, it penetrated deep into the rocks. The head of the staff made a slight crisp sound. Accompanied by the old monk's words, it floated in all directions. The old monk looked at the distant Chaoyang city and said, "Regarding the catastrophe of the human world and the coming of the Dharma-ending age, the Buddha left many instruments such as the chessboard and bell before his nirvana to point out the path for the Buddhist disciples. However, you refused to follow the path left by the Buddha and wanted to walk your own path. Why is that?" After standing silently on the peak for a long time, the old monk sighed and said, "Senior brother, I never understood why you called yourself Mount Chishan. After Qinyan explained it to me, I realized that it was a divergent road. However, the divergent road is difficult to walk. Buddha is merciful. How can he bear to see the world take the risk of taking a divergent road?" After saying this, the old monk pulled his staff out of the snow rock and slowly walked down the peak. It seemed that he was going to Chaoyang City. However, it took him more than 100 days to reach the edge of the wilderness from the Shenkong Temple in the giant sinkhole at such a slow and arduous way of walking. How long would it take for him to reach the cloud? "You took the wrong path, so I have to take the shortcut." The old monk walked out of the range of the peak and stopped in his tracks. He stretched out his staff on the side of the rugged and muddy mountain path. From his actions, he seemed to be calling for a carriage. However, how could there be a carriage in such a remote mountain where few people tread? This winter, Chaoyang City, the capital of the Ueluan Kingdom, had continuous gloomy weather. Even after 2 light snowfalls, the thick clouds above the city did not disperse. In the human world, wind and snow were common. Even 100 days of gloomy weather was not difficult to imagine. Therefore, in the beginning, the clouds did not attract anyone's attention. It was not until the winter deepened and the second snowfall dispersed that the countryside outside of Chaoyang City suddenly cleared up. It was clear and bright, but Chaoyang City was still covered with thick clouds. This puzzled the people in the city. If there was something they did not understand, they had to find out. Once they started observing, the imperial court and ordinary citizens of the Ueluan Kingdom finally noticed the strangeness of the thick clouds in the sky. Some people remembered that the clouds above their heads had not dissipated since a certain day in late autumn. More people noticed that in the clear sky outside the city, there were still clouds floating over every day and gathering in the clouds above the city. The clouds shrouded Chaoyang City and refused to disperse. They became thicker and larger every day. This situation was too strange. Since autumn, the Buddhist temples in the Ueluan Kingdom had announced the arrival of the daughter of Yama. The imperial court's arrest warrant had proved that the daughter of Yama was in the Ueluan Kingdom. All these things were connected to the thick clouds above Chaoyang City, which immediately deepened the uneasiness and fear in the hearts of the people. The people of Chaoyang City naturally had many speculations and uneasiness. The clouds became the focus of everyone's attention. It even became the main topic of conversation between the citizens of the Ueluan Kingdom every day. "Did you see the clouds yesterday? I can see them every day when I look up. Why do I have to look? I mean the new clouds that floated in from outside yesterday. Didn't you notice that the clouds are much thicker today? I didn't notice it. I went to rent a carriage yesterday. The new clouds were quite big yesterday. Very big. When I saw it, it was already very close. It must be bigger than the imperial palace. That's not small. But I saw a new cloud coming from the east a few days ago. TSK. That formation, that spirit, it felt like thousands of Tang soldiers and horses. That's a good analogy. Isn't the daughter of Yama a Tang? Don't mention the daughter of Yama to me. I'm a coward. You're not a coward. You're a careful person. You rented a carriage in advance of leaving, right? I have to leave. The clouds are too strange. If one day they turn into stones and fall down, I won't be able to withstand it. Snowy clouds ravaged the city. The people in the city would look up for a long time every day. There were fewer and fewer people suffering from cervical spondylosis. Many people began to pray. The streets were filled with the smell of incense. The temples received more and more incense money. Some people were already preparing to leave Chaoyang City and hide with relatives in the countryside for a few days. The business of the carriage house became more and more prosperous. The uneasy atmosphere grew stronger as the incense burned. People panicked and began to pray to anything that they thought was effective. Whether it was a stone or a tree, the master in the temple was naturally the best choice. Thus, in just a few days, no one knew how many young ladies in their mansions had been harmed. There were countless Buddhist temples in the Yueluan kingdom, among which the most famous were the 72 temples in Misty Rain. The White Tower Temple in Chaoyang City had an unquestionable position among the 72 temples. In the current situation where people were in a state of panic, the White Tower Temple was naturally the most popular. Every day, the number of believers who came to pray to the Buddha almost overwhelmed the Buddhist temple. All the halls in the White Tower Temple were filled with believers. Even outside the temple, there were countless people kneeling. Dozens of believers knelt respectfully in front of a stone step outside the temple. They kept kowtowing and looked especially pious. The reason why the stone steps attracted so many Buddhist believers was because the abbot of the White Tower Temple had picked up a baby boy with a deep affinity with Buddha on the stone steps in the morning. The baby boy was the famous Master Daoshe, so the believers believed that the stone steps still had the Buddha nature of Master Daoshe, which could bring them good fortune. Looking at this scene, Ning Kei shook his head. Holding Song Song's slightly cold hand, they squeezed through the crowd and walked into the White Tower Temple. He thought to himself that Kuni Mati and Bao Shu had an affair and gave birth to an illegitimate son, Daoshe. Naturally, he had to be sent to the White Tower Temple. What did it have to do with Buddhism? Sang Sang wore a light-colored cotton-padded jacket and a thick scarf that covered half of her face. Her hair had been cut very short and parted diagonally in front of her forehead. She looked very refreshing, like a playful little boy. Even those who had seen her in person would not be able to recognize her, let alone those who had only seen her portrait. Maybe that stone step can really bring blessings. Song Song's voice penetrated through the scarf and sounded a little muffled, as if she had caught a cold. Ning Kei smiled and said softly, "Even if there are blessings, they will not fall on us. Don't forget that in front of the bun shop in Chang'an, I chopped off Daoshe's head." Sang Sang said, "I don't know if it's because we have done too many bad things. If I had known that I was going to learn Buddhism, I would not have been so disrespectful to the Buddhist masters." Ning Kei smiled and said, "The day before I met Daoshe, you ran away from home for the first time. I was in a very bad mood and was angry for the whole night by Yanming Lake. You still came to provoke me. Naturally, he was courting death. It's all your fault." Sang Sang said softly, "So it's my retribution. If there was really retribution, Xiaohe would not have needed me to kill him. He would have been killed by Buddha long ago. Whether it is Haotian Taoism or the Buddhism sect, when they talk about the academy, they will always mention the term non-believer. In their eyes, without faith and reverence, it is difficult to live a fulfilling life, and it is difficult to find true peace in one's heart. However, in the eyes of the academy, faith and worship are not the same thing. The word fear and reverence needs to be carefully studied." Ning Kei thought of the believers who kept kowtowing outside the temple and the scene of the family next to the small courtyard burning incense and worshipping a tree every day. He said, "Countries like the Yueluan kingdom naturally have faith. But there are too many things to believe in and too much fear of the unknown. What kind of faith is that?" As they chatted in a low voice, the two had already walked to the main hall in the depths of the White Tower Temple. The hall was still crowded with hundreds of believers kneeling on futons, listening to an eminent monk preaching in front of them. Ning Kei led Sang Sang into the hall and quietly found an empty futon. The believer whose futon had been stolen was listening attentively to the sutra a moment ago, but the next moment, he found himself standing behind a pillar. He was shocked and speechless, but he did not dare to shout, for fear that the eminent monks in the temple would think that he was not pious enough and ended up like this. Sang Sang knelt on the futon and put her hands together in front of her. She closed her eyes and began to listen to Buddhism. She looked quiet and pious. Her hair, which was slightly black because it was cut short, slowly swayed on her forehead. She did not listen to the White Tower Temple's preaching, but only silently recited a passage in her heart. She was not learning the solemn golden Buddha in front of the hall, but the Buddha in her heart. I came back full of energy and aching all over. This is the first chapter of today and also the first chapter of the fourth volume. The curtain slowly lowered, but in fact the real curtain was slowly lifted. Let's finish it together. I will try to finish the next chapter before 10:10. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 6:19. Find the daughter of Yama, save the world and save themselves. This was what everyone in the world was thinking. After confirming that the daughter of Yama was hiding in the Ueluan kingdom, the Buddhism sect naturally wanted to get rid of Sang Sang. Even under such circumstances, Ning Ke hid in Chaoyang City with Sang Sang, visited many Buddhist temples inside and outside the city, and calmly studied Buddhism and read scriptures. This was completely out of the Taoism and Buddhism sect's expectations. It also proved that the most dangerous place was the safest place. Compared to this, there was something more wonderful. Buddha had read the Ming hand scroll of the tomes of arcane many years ago and could see the coming of the everlasting night in the Dharma ending age. For this, Buddha had left countless celestial weapons and prepared many methods to suppress the son of Yama, so that the human world could escape from Yama's gaze. However, even Buddha would not have thought that the Dharma he left in the human world could help Sang Sang temporarily suppress the cold aura in her body. The chanting of sutras filled the temple. A peaceful and compassionate aura gradually spread with the devout prayers of the believers. Sang Sang closed her eyes and put her palms together. Her expression was tranquil and devout. She cultivated her own Buddhism, read her own sutras, and felt the peaceful and compassionate aura around her. Her pale face gradually returned to normal. The senior monk of the White Tower Temple finished his lecture and so did the believers. Hundreds of people on the futons in the temple chanted the name of Buddha, but they did not disperse. The senior monk began to lead the believers to pray. The content of the prayer was very complicated, but if one listened carefully, there were only two things. The first was to pray for the Buddha to appear and help the countries in the Central Plains to chase away the barbaric and bloody desolate man tribes from the wilderness. The second was to pray for the Buddha to appear and quickly find the daughter of Yama and then suppress her so that she would never be able to rise again. After the prayer, Ning Ke walked into the temple and helped Sang Sang up. In the Buddhist temples and even the streets of Chaoyang City, such prayers with fear and the most vicious curses could be heard. He was already used to it, so he was calm. However, as the target of the curse, Sang Sang was inevitably a little depressed. Just as Ning Ke and Sang Sang walked out of the White Tower Temple, they suddenly heard the melodious bell ringing from the eaves of the temple behind them. The bell rang continuously for a long time, sounding very solemn. Which big shot has arrived? Ning Ke turned his head and looked into the depths of the White Tower Temple. He thought that the person who could make the White Tower Temple ring so many bells must be extraordinary. He was afraid that it was either someone from the Xiankong Temple or a powerhouse from the West Hill Divine Palace. There could only be one purpose for a high monk from the Xiankong Temple or a powerhouse from the West Hill Divine Palace to appear in Chaoyang City at this time. He frowned and became more vigilant. If Ning Ke knew the real meaning of these bells, he would definitely be more vigilant. If he had the chance to hear the voice behind the bells, he would definitely leave Chaoyang City with Sang Sang immediately. In the depths of the Buddhist temple, the bells slowly stopped ringing. In a remote Buddhist hall, the abbot of the White Tower Temple and a few elders of extremely high seniority knelt respectfully on the ground. An old and peaceful voice echoed in the hall. Beneath the clouds, winter was coming to an end. In many countries in the world, such as the Great River Kingdom or the South Jin Kingdom, spring had already covered both sides of the river. In the Lank Temple on the Hua Mountain that was being rebuilt, wildflowers were also in full bloom. But there were more places that were waiting for the arrival of spring. For example, the capital of the Ueluan Kingdom, which was already full of spring in the past years, was still in the final stages of winter because of the clouds that covered the sky for hundreds of days and the relatively low temperature. In the depths of the wilderness in the far northeast, the desolate man tribe was constantly hurt by the cold and betrayal. The wilderness, which had been extremely turbulent and bloody for the past year, once again welcomed a tragic war after a few dozen days of peace. Countless lives were coldly harvested. In the late autumn, the desolate man tribe had just reached an alliance agreement with the left king's palace. Both parties swore a blood oath with their respective tribes' ancestral spirits. The senior statesmen of the Desolate Man tribe were slightly relieved and were planning to join forces with the left king's palace to attack the Central Plains coalition army in the coming spring and summer. However, the Desolate Man did not expect that the left king's palace would dare to betray their own ancestral spirits. In the middle of winter, the left king's palace brazenly tore up the alliance agreement that had not even dried yet. They joined hands with the West Hill Divine Palace and received a large batch of provisions from the grassland. Then they led the Central Plains Coalition Army and ventured 800 miles to the north against the bitter cold. They launched a surprise attack on the second largest settlement of the Desolate Man's tribe. Although the Desolate Man were brave and extremely strong, and every adult was a natural warrior, there were too few of them. The whole year of war had sharply reduced the winter rations they had stored. It was almost as if they were fighting with half an empty stomach. In the face of the sneak attack by the left king's palace and the West Hill Divine Palace, especially the assassination of a large number of powerful cultivators, the Desolate Man could only hold on for 3 days no matter how brave they were. They had to leave thousands of warriors' corpses and were forced to leave. The left king's palace and the West Hill Divine Palace's coalition army did not stop moving forward. They knew how strong the Desolate Man's vitality was and how firm their will to fight was. Although the sneak attack from thousands of miles away had successfully damaged the strength of the Desolate Man tribe, no one could guarantee how strong the Desolate Man tribe would be next year or a few years later if they did not completely defeat the Desolate Man. Under the fierce request or cold threat of the silver-masked military counselor, the West Hill Divine Palace's coalition army followed the cavalry of the left king's palace and continued to move north. The generals from the Yen Kingdom and the South Jin Kingdom were shocked to find that the West Hill Divine Palace seemed to have known the military counselor's true identity. They even listened to him, just like the fatuous Chanyu of the left king's palace. The chase in the harsh winter, which was too cruel for both sides, lasted for 5 days. On the snow-covered wilderness, the frozen corpses of the Central Plainsmen, barbarians, and Desolate Men were scattered everywhere. The corpses were so hard that the vultures were unwilling to eat them. After death they could finally live together peacefully. On the 5th night of the bitter and cruel pursuit, Tang, the world wayfarer of the Devil's Doctrine, finally managed to sneak into the camp without being noticed by the dozen array tactical masters that the West Hill Divine Palace had placed outside the military camp. In the tent in the wind and snow, Tang did not see the panicked generals from various countries, nor did he see the shrieking secretaries. What he saw were dozens of cultivation powerhouses from various countries who were already prepared, and the military counselor sitting behind the desk. The military counselor wore a silver mask. There were 2 bowls of cool wine on the desk. His face that was not covered by the mask looked calm and natural, as if he was a good host who had been waiting for a long time for a guest but was not anxious. Tang knew who the military counselor was. He looked around at the powerhouses in the tent and said, "It seems that you are indeed the one in charge of the left king's palace. No wonder those barbarians dared to betray their ancestors. But in my opinion, no matter what happened to you, you are still a coward. So you will never be able to catch up with Ning Quebec." Long Qing did not continue Tang's words. He pointed at the 2 bowls of wine on the desk and said calmly, "After I left Chong'an that year, I never drank again. It was not because I was afraid of making mistakes, but because I could not find anything in the world that was worth drinking for. Until I found out that you might come to kill me." Tang asked, "Being killed by me is indeed something worth celebrating?" Long Qing shook his head and said calmly, "I had already guessed that you would come to kill me like how you killed Xia Ho. Since you are still so stupid, I will not be as stupid as Xia Ho, who cherishes the lives of his subordinates. So naturally you will be killed by me. Of course, it is something worth celebrating that I have killed the world wayfarer of the Devil's Doctrine and the #1 powerhouse of the Desolate Man. After you die, I will ask the generals to stab a spear into your head and patrol in front of the battle. Although it may not shake the fighting spirit of the Desolate Man, it can make their brains more difficult to use. They will not try to continue to escape to the north. Then this pursuit will become the final battle." He looked at Tang with a smile and continued, "After you die, the Devil's Doctrine will be gone, and so will the Desolate Man. If I were you, I would not put myself in danger no matter what. However, I still want to thank you for letting me become the person who ended the history of the Devil's Doctrine and the history of the Desolate Man. Then, in the history books of the future, whether it is Koharan who broke into the Devil's Doctrine with a single sword or the Tang cavalry 1,000 years ago, they will all be below me." Tang looked at Long Qing, who was behind the desk, and said, "I admit that you are very good at commanding on the battlefield. I also admit that your thinking is more complicated than mine. However, your level is still too low, so there are many things that you will never understand. Not to mention the Tang cavalry and Mr. Ku 1,000 years ago, the current you is not even comparable to Xiahou. Long Qing's eyes lit up slightly and said, "Please enlighten me." Tang slowly raised his right hand and clenched it into a fist. The animal skin that bound the iron fist creaked and said, "If it is an ambush, then you need to kill me. If you can't kill me today, then it can only be called an ambush. There have been countless ambushes in the past thousands of years. Those that can be written in the history books are all jokes." Long Qing's eyes became brighter and brighter. He said, "I know that you are very powerful. I have prepared for a long time for this. I can't think of any reason why I can't kill you with my current combat power." The wind and snow were blowing hard at night. The tent was torn into countless ropes. The sound of the fist wind sounded like thunder. The bright sword light shuttled back and forth like lightning. The black peach blossoms bloomed and then disappeared. The leather ropes on Tang Yi's iron fists were all broken. On his body that was like cast iron, there were countless wounds left by flying swords. His entire body was dyed with blood. He had suffered unimaginable injuries. But in the end he still successfully rushed out of the camp that stretched for more than 10 miles, disappearing into the wind and snow. In this battle, 200 elite cavalrymen of the left king's palace died. 11 cultivators at the upper see-through state from the central plains were torn into pieces. 2 priests of the left king's palace were shaken into blood foam. A powerhouse at the peak of the knowing destiny state from Haotian Taoism, who had lived in seclusion in the kingdom of Song for many years, had a bloody hole the size of a bowl in his chest and abdomen. He died with his eyes open. Long Qing's natal peach blossom was smashed into pieces by a simple iron fist. He was thrown far away and vomited blood. His silver mask and black robe were completely dyed red. Before the battle, Long Qing could not understand why Dun was still confident that he could survive, given the combat strength at that time. After the battle ended, he supported his weak and injured body to review and deduce for a long time, but he still could not understand why he could not kill Dun. Just as Tang had said, Long Qing was now at the upper knowing destiny state. Although his plans were excellent and accurate, he was still far from the cavalry of the Tang Empire thousands of years ago. He was not as good as Xiahou and was not qualified to be mentioned in the same breath as Mr. Ku. Because his level was not high enough, he did not understand people like Tang. Once they fell into a situation that made them crazy, they would often make their enemies crazy. Sometimes there was no reason at all. After this battle, many powerhouses of the coalition army were killed and injured. They had no choice but to stop chasing the desolate man's tribe and slowly retreat to the south. The countries of the Central Plains and the left king's palace began to get nervous. This time the desolate man's tribe suffered heavy losses. No one knew how many women and children were killed, but they were not completely destroyed by the coalition army. According to the desolate man's character, once they recovered, they would definitely launch the bloodiest revenge against the left king's palace and the Central Plains coalition army. No matter how one looked at it, Long Qing was the one who gained the most from this bitter winter war. Through the agreement with the West Hill Divine Palace before the war, the left king's palace had gained a lot of benefits. They had even obtained several important resources from the Yen kingdom. Their power had increased rapidly, and his control over the left king's palace had been further strengthened. Most importantly, through the communication with the West Hill Divine Palace, Long Qing realized that the Divine Hall did not care about his betrayal. The Hierarch Lord had even secretly conveyed some extremely important information. He had killed the half-man Taoist in the Jishou Abbey, absorbed his power and betrayed Haotian Taoism. As someone from the West Hill Divine Palace, he was very clear about the terrifying power of Haotian Taoism. Therefore, being chased by the Divine Hall had always been the greatest fear in his heart. Now that this fear had finally disappeared, he naturally felt refreshed. However, as the old fear faded, new fear arose. In the ambush that night in the wind and snow, Tang's image had left a deep impression on Long Qing, and he could not suppress his fear. The only comfort he could feel was that among those who had survived that battle, Tang had suffered the heaviest injury. Logically speaking, he would definitely die. Even if he could survive, he would have to focus on recuperating in the following period of time. It was impossible for him to pose a specific threat to Long Qing. The desolate man would definitely launch a bloody revenge. In order to prepare for the real war, the countries in the Central Plains had begun to prepare their provisions and troops. The South Jin Kingdom Royal Cavalry and the Divine Hall's Papal Cavalrymen, who had not participated in the war all these years, had begun to prepare to enter the wilderness. Even the 2 border armies of the Tang Empire had begun to prepare for battle. But even so, the people's attention on the Yueluan kingdom did not weaken at all. On the contrary, It became more and more intense, especially those powerhouses who had stayed here all along and did not even glance at the wilderness. The war between the Central Plains Coalition Army and the Desolate Man would determine the outcome of the war between civilizations. However, the matter of the Ueluan Kingdom would determine the survival of the entire world. Everyone knew which was more important. Many days had passed, but no one had found any traces of the Black Horse carriage. The ascetic monks that the Xiankong Temple had scattered in the northeast wilderness gradually moved towards the Ueluan Kingdom. In a Zen temple more than 100 miles north of Chaoyang City, the chief monk of the Xiankong Temple's Hall of Respect, Master Chi Mei, was quietly listening to the voice in front of the Buddha statue. He is under the clouds. The clouds above Chaoyang City had not dispersed and had already attracted the attention of many cultivators. Many powerhouses from the Buddhist and Taoist sects had already quietly sneaked into the city. At this time, after hearing the voice of the chief monk of scripture, Chi Mei no longer hesitated. He rushed to Chaoyang City that night and entered the White Tower Temple. The next morning, the commander of the West Hill Divine Palace Divine Guards, Luo Kadi, also rushed to Chaoyang City with 18 divine guards. At this time, a cloud floated in the blue sky outside the city and merged into the thick clouds above the city. The clouds above Chaoyang City were getting thicker and thicker. It was very difficult for sunlight to pass through, so it looked darker and darker. There was a feeling of dark clouds pressing down on the city, but no one knew when it would really snow or rain. Inside the White Tower Temple, Chi Mei looked at the man who was as burly as a mountain in front of him. He put his palms together and bowed slowly, saying, "Greetings, Commander Luo." Luo Kadi silently sized up the seemingly ordinary middle-aged monk in front of him. His eyes fell on the monk's left hand that only had 2 fingers left on the side of the monk's leg. He nodded slightly in return. He was the most trusted subordinate of the West Hill Divine Palace hierarch. Although he had been punished by the great divine priest of judgment Yi Hongyu for the past 2 years because of that incident, he was still a very important bigwig in the Divine Hall. He had entered the knowing destiny state for many years. He was powerful and arrogant, so even in front of the eminent monk from the unknown place Xiankong Temple, he still refused to show too much respect. He even pretended to be cold and arrogant. Chi Mei's expression was calm and natural. There was no change at all. He had long achieved great success in Buddhism, so he would not be disturbed by these external things. He said, "I heard that the great divine priest of judgment had left Peach Mountain 100 days ago. Where is she now?" Luo Kadi frowned and said, "The great divine priest has gone to the northeast." Chi Mei sighed softly and said, "That's not good." Luo Kadi said, "If Ning Ke and the daughter of Yama are really in Chaoyang City, we can just find them and kill them. What's wrong with that?" Chi Mei said, "There are too few people from Haotian Taoism this time. I don't know if it's because the Abbey Dean is traveling overseas or for some other reason. This time, when the daughter of Yama appeared, you guys did not respond appropriately." Luo Kadi frowned slightly and said in a low voice, "We don't need too many people to kill Ning Ke. Besides, do you think that the 18 divine guards and I are too weak?" Chi Mei said, "In the battle at the Lank Temple, even senior brother Qin Yen and Mr. Yi could not stop Ning Ke and the daughter of Yama. Why does the commander think that we can stop them?" Luo Kadi thought of what Mr. First and Second of the Academy had done in the Lank Temple. His expression turned serious and he asked, "Will Master Qin Yen come?" Chi Mei said, "Senior brother Qin Yen was seriously injured in the Lank Temple and is still recuperating." Luo Kadi said, "If that's the case, what about the people from the Academy?" Chi Mei said, "If the people from the Academy come, the Xiankong Temple will have a solution." "We are still talking about Ning Quebec," Luo Kadi said coldly. "Although there are not many people from Haotian Taoism, there are many people in Chaoyang City. If this is a war, why should we spare our lives? The hierarch wants me to ask if the daughter of Yama can die if thousands of people die in Chaoyang City. Will the Buddhism sect do it or not?" Chi Mei was silent for a long time and then said, "The human world is people's home. In order to stop this catastrophe, I think no one will be unwilling to sacrifice their lives. We have no choice but to ask all living beings to help." Amended 201211210330, to be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 620. Luo Kadi recalled that the middle-aged monk had said that if the academy sent someone, the Xiankong Temple would have its own way. He suddenly thought of a possibility and asked in disbelief, "Will the chief preaching monk do something?" Chi Mei said calmly, "My teacher will not do anything. What shocked Luo Kadi was not that the chief preaching monk of Shenkong Temple had made a move. Although this matter itself was enough to shock the entire cultivation world, he was afraid of the possible consequences. The abbey dean of the Jishou Abbey and the chief preaching monk of the Shenkong Temple were basically mythical figures in the Taoist and Buddhist sections. No one dared to challenge them or even speak disrespectfully to them. It was said that for many years, only the headmaster had fought with them once. The results of these two battles were clear. Since then the abbey dean had left the Jishou Abbey and traveled to the South Sea. He had not set foot on land for decades, and no one had ever heard of the chief preaching monk fighting again. According to the person who told Luo Kadi, the headmaster had reached an agreement after defeating the two big shots. No matter what happened in the world, the three of them had to stay on the sidelines. The reason why it was said to be a rumor and not a legend was because this story had not spread at all. Other than the three's core disciples, only the hierarch of the West Hill Divine Palace and the sage of Sword Lu Bai had vaguely heard of this matter. Although Luo Kadi was the most favored follower of the West Hill hierarch, he had no right to know. However, 2 years ago when he had knelt in front of the hierarch lord's palace and asked to marry Yi Hongyu, he was worried that he would offend Yi Su and anger the Jishou Abbey. The hierarch lord had mentioned this matter intentionally or unintentionally. The hierarch of the West Hill Divine Palace was the highest leader of Haotian Taoism in the secular world. Every word and action of his had a profound meaning, and it was impossible for him to slip up. According to Luo Kadi's analysis, the hierarch lord should be trying to reassure him and improve the status of the West Hill Divine Palace in Haotian Taoism. It was even a means to compete with the Jishou Abbey. Luo Kadi was worried that the chief preaching monk of Shenkong Temple would break the agreement and provoke the headmaster to take action himself. If the headmaster really took action, wouldn't all the preparations made by the Buddhist and Taoist sects be a joke? Now that he heard Chi Mei's denial, he was slightly relieved. However, he was worried that Chi Mei would notice something, so he turned and left the temple. He led the 18 divine guards out of the White Tower Temple and walked towards the palace of the Yueluan Kingdom. Chi Mei frowned as he watched Luo Kadi's burly figure disappear into the palace. In just a moment he could tell that the commander of the West Hill Divine Guards was in the knowing destiny state, and it was a very stable middle state. He was very powerful and should be above Ning Quebec. The divine halls of West Hill sent this person, and the divine priest of judgment also came down from the Peach Mountain. Logically speaking, they should pay enough attention to him, but he still felt that there was something wrong. A few days ago, a piece of news came from the eastern wilderness. The wayfarer of the Devil's Doctrine, Tang Ji, broke into the military camp and escaped with serious injuries. However, he also killed many powerful cultivators from the Central Plains. The most painful loss of the West Hill Divine Palace in that battle was the death of a powerful cultivator at the peak of the knowing destiny state who had been living in seclusion in the kingdom of Song for many years. There were only a few powerful cultivators at the peak of the knowing destiny state in the entire cultivation world. However, the West Hill Divine Palace could hide one in the Taoist temple in the kingdom of Song. How powerful was the Haotian Taoism hidden under the sea? Moreover, such a noble powerful cultivator at the peak of the knowing destiny state actually cooperated with the allied forces to take the risk of killing the wayfarer of the Devil's Doctrine. The West Hill Divine Palace was willing to invest so much power and paid such a high price in the wilderness. Facing the catastrophe of the world, the West Hill Divine Palace also invested a lot of power in the Yueluan Kingdom. However, it was still too stingy in comparison. It was hard not to arouse suspicion. You were so hurt by the headmaster's stick that you still don't want to face the academy at this time? In your eyes, if the daughter of Yama is a bowl of porridge, then the Shenkong Temple is the spoon. You don't want to do anything but you want the spoon to scoop out the porridge. Abidine, you are really calculating. Chi Mei slowly walked out of the hall. He looked up at the thick black clouds in the sky and thought silently in his heart. The people from the Shenkong Temple, the West Hill Divine Palace, and the people in countless streets. No matter how powerful Ning Ke was, he could only die. However, he killed the daughter of Yama and saved the world. No matter how unreasonable the academy was, they could not use this as an excuse to take revenge on the Buddhism and Buddhism sects. However, the story in the autumn rain at the Lank Temple a year ago had already proved that if they wanted to kill the daughter of Yama, they had to kill Ning Quebec, killing the last disciple of the headmaster. No matter whether there was a reason or not, no matter what the situation was at that time, the people on the second floor of the academy would find their own reason and then be angry. Chi Mei believed that after this, the cultivation world would be in turmoil. And the person who killed Ning Ke would eventually be killed even if he hid in the South Sea like the Abbey Dean. Listening to the sound of scriptures in the front temple and looking at the dark clouds above, He was silent for a long time. His expression changed from worry to determination and calmness. He murmured, "If I don't enter the netherworld, who will?" Winter left and spring was coming. Everything was as usual. The thick clouds were still suspended in the sky above Chaoyang City, motionless. The smell of burning incense in the streets was still as strong. The business of the carriage and horse business was as prosperous as usual. The sound of chanting scriptures could still be heard in the back gardens of officials and rich businessmen. Only occasionally there would be news of a young lady's sudden death. Ning Ke looked calm on the surface, but he was very anxious and under great pressure. The thick clouds in the sky seemed to be pressing on him, making it difficult for him to breathe. He did not know what those thicker and darker clouds meant, but he vaguely guessed that it had something to do with Sang Sang. The pursuit after exposing his whereabouts made him even more uneasy. If it was only the powerhouses of Buddhism and Taoism who wanted to kill him, it would not be a big deal. What he was really vigilant about was whether the cultivation world would let the ordinary people in the secular world join in the war. He was not referring to the wanted posters in the search of the army, but to the real ordinary people, the thousands and countless ordinary people in the whole world. There had always been an unwritten rule in the cultivation world. The battle between cultivators should avoid affecting the lives of the secular world as much as possible, and avoid involving the ordinary people. However, the pursuit of Sang Sang was related to the danger of the destruction of the world. Ning Ke believed that the Buddhism and Taoism would definitely not care about these rules. It was not terrible to be the enemy of the whole world, but it was terrible to be the enemy of everyone in the world. No matter where you went and what you did, you would face endless attacks. That would be the most terrible thing. Being hit by a spoon every moment and never stop being hit by a spoon. That spoon would not be broken. No matter where you hid, that spoon would find you and hit you on the head. Even if you were not hit to death, you would be tortured to death unless you could kill the person holding the spoon. But now everyone in the world was holding a spoon in their hand. Could you kill everyone in the world? The last two sentences are about the spoon killing. I have read it before and like it very much. It is very scary. I recommend it. The 6th morning of the first chapter is changed to the 5th night, and I have also corrected some mistakes. I hope to reduce the mistakes as much as possible. In fact, there are many words in the book that I hope you can remember after reading it, because the seemingly plain narration is basically the beginning of a trap. I have written 10,000 words today and I hope to write more tomorrow. Let's start the battle, but I will not open a single chapter. I will say it here. If you have any monthly votes, please vote for Near Night. Thank you. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 6:21. Even if there are thousands of people in front of me, I will go if I want to. Ning Ke muttered to himself. This was a sentence that second brother once told him about youngest uncle. When he heard this sentence, he was overwhelmed with emotions and felt hot all over. However, it seemed that he had to face such a situation now. Only then did he realize that it was not so simple. Sang Sang was warming her feet with hot water. When she heard this sentence, she was slightly startled and said, "How heroic." Ning Ke sat on the small stool in front of the basin and lowered his head to rub her feet. He said with a smile, "When the enemy invades and the evil forces are rampant, you will be a hero no matter how you kill. Only a hero can be called a hero. But now we are the villains, the legendary devils. If we kill thousands of people with a sword, it is called killing the innocent. It is cruel and evil. It has nothing to do with being a hero." Sang Sang's little feet were still so white, like a white lotus in the wooden basin. She looked at Ning Ke, who kept rubbing her feet, and asked, "Is it important to be a hero?" Ning Ke took off the towel from his shoulder and lifted her feet out of the basin. He dried them carefully and put them on his knees. He rubbed them again and put on thick cotton socks for her. He said, "You know me. As long as I can survive, I don't mind killing people. But it is better if I can be cool when I kill people." Sang Sang tightened the laces of the socks, turned from the chair to the bed, lifted the thick quilt and got in. Only her little face was exposed. She stared at Ning Ke and asked confusedly, "What do you mean by cool?" Ning Ke looked at the water in the basin, which was still warm. He took off his shoes and put his feet in. He answered casually, "It means being handsome with no expression." Sang Sang asked confusedly, "How can I be handsome with no expression?" Ning Ke said, "Haven't you seen second brother's dead face?" Sang Sang seemed to understand and said, "Mr. Second is really handsome. But I still don't understand why it is called cool. Besides, we are all killing people. Why do we care about being handsome?" "You have never heard of such words as cold, arrogant, and arrogant. Naturally, you don't understand the truth. Not to mention killing people. Even if you want to take a bath or go to the toilet, you can be extremely handsome. Ning Ke said with a smile. He got up and went outside to pour out the water for washing his feet. When he walked back to his room, he suddenly remembered something. He rummaged through his luggage for a long time and took out a wooden box. In the box were 2 pairs of glasses made of ink. He took out one and put it on the bridge of his nose. Then, he walked to the bed and looked at Sang Sang expressionlessly like second brother. Is it cool? Sang Sang looked at him and couldn't help but laugh. Then she thought of something and looked at the hair in front of her, frowning slightly. In autumn, her hair was cut short by Ning Quebec. It looked refreshing, but it was difficult to tie her black hair after it was cut short. She tried several times with a hairpin, but failed to stop her hair from flying in front of her eyes. She puckered her lips and blew her hair away from her eyes. Suddenly, she asked absent-mindedly, "Did Mr. Six make this thing on your face and that pair of glasses together?" She might be pouting because she was drying her hair, or she might be expressing some kind of dissatisfaction and acting coquettishly. Ning Ke was startled. He took off his glasses and said, "How would I remember that?" Sang Sang said, "You have been hiding the glasses in your luggage. How could you not remember that?" Ning Ke said, "When we were about to leave the Lank Temple, you were the one who took the glasses out of your luggage and threw them to her." Sang Sang pulled the quilt higher to cover her chin, which had become thinner because of her illness. She didn't want to look too mean, but she pretended to be wronged and said, "You put the glasses in your luggage because you thought that you might meet Miss Shanshan in the Lank Temple. So you planned to give them to her when you met her." Recently, Sang Sang occasionally got jealous and lost her temper. With Ning Ke's temperament in the past, he would have long lost control. But now, no matter how angry Sang Sang was, he just smiled. Because he thought that Sang Sang was very cute. Sang Sang's short hair was refreshing and cute. Her 2 white front teeth were silly and cute. She was charming and cute when she pretended to be angry. She was cute when she frowned when she slept. She was cute when she held 2 long chopsticks when she ate. No matter what she did or didn't do, she was still cute. Ning Ke was in a very good mood. He reached out and messed up her short hair. He shouted, "My Sang Sang can't be so cute. Tell me, which cave did you come from?" "I am the daughter of Yama. I am a witch." Sang Sang grabbed the edge of the quilt with both hands and opened her eyes wide. She looked at him seriously, but she couldn't help giggling. She looked extremely cute. A crow's unpleasant caw came from outside the window. Ning Ke patted her slightly cold face and said gently, "I'll go out and have a look. You go to sleep first." Sang Sang said, "Be careful." Ning Ke nodded and pushed the door into the small courtyard. It was already dusk. The sun was slowly setting in the west. The red light shone into Chaoyang City and the thick clouds in the sky, giving it a strange red color. He looked up at the thick clouds burning like a sea of fire above his head. He shook his head and left. Sang Sang put on a fur coat and climbed out of the quilt. She walked to the window and skillfully prepared to block the light. Suddenly she saw the burning clouds in the sky. Her little hand that was pulling the curtain paused. Ning Ke didn't know what those clouds represented. He only knew that they were related to her. She didn't know what those clouds represented either. But she knew that they might mean her departure or even death. Just as the previous joke said, Sang Sang couldn't be so cute. Sang Sang just wanted to show her cutest side in the last days before her death. She hoped that she could leave Ning Ke some good memories instead of sad ones. The whole world was their enemy. Ning Ke knew that if he and Sang Sang were hiding in Chang'an, they would have been found and killed by the Tang Empire. Fortunately, they were hiding in Chaoyang City. The government of the Yueluan Kingdom was extremely inefficient. Although the people who were devout to Buddhism feared and hated the daughter of Yama, none of them would get rid of their lazy nature to help the Buddhism sect and the government in their search. It was because of these reasons that he and Sang Sang could hide in this city for an entire winter. But now that he was alarmed, it was time to leave. Ning Ke didn't go out of the city, although he wanted to confirm whether the big black horse and the carriage were safe. He went directly to a garden behind the Imperial Palace and walked along the walls of the White Tower Temple to the side door of the Imperial Palace. He hid his body in the darkness and silently observed and listened for a long time, making the final additions to his plan. Then he walked around the streets and alleys of Chaoyang City. He held the broken big black umbrella tightly wrapped in an old cloth in his hand to confirm the direction of the aura of the powerhouses. "I've recently used Sogu Wubi and changed a certain setting. So I often make mistakes between Go, Cloud, and Ji. I'm ashamed to report to you. This is the first chapter of today. There are 4 chapters of 12,000 words in total. The second chapter will be finished before 11:50. If I still have the strength after finishing the 4 chapters, I will revise the last chapter yesterday and try to be more detailed in the future. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 622. Night fell and it was time for dinner. The citizens of the Ueluan kingdom, who usually liked to squat down on the street and chat with their neighbors, all went back to their houses. The street seemed deserted, perhaps because they were afraid of the clouds above or because of the rumors about the daughter of Yama. Only the officers of the government were patrolling. The security in Chaoyang City was much tighter than last autumn, but Ning Ke believed that it would not be a problem to sneak out with Sang Sang. He had sensed with his psyche power using the big black umbrella and found that there were many more powerhouses in Chaoyang City. What made him even more alarmed was that the imperial court of the Ueluan kingdom had obviously strengthened the search inside Chaoyang City. Soldiers could be seen everywhere on the streets. Could it be that the Buddhism and Taoism sects had confirmed that they were in Chaoyang City? It seemed that they really had to leave this time. But where would they go? If Ning Ke was alone, he would have left Chaoyang City long ago. He was confident that he would not be found by the Buddhism and Taoism sects, no matter if he went back to the academy or somewhere else. However, he dared not act rashly with Sang Sang, who was still ill. He had lived in Chaoyang City for more than 100 days, but he did not see any trace of eldest brother. It seemed that eldest brother had never been here, which made him guess that the Buddhism and Taoism sects might have used some method. But he could not search carefully because the most important thing to hide was to cut off any contact with the outside world. Ning Ke was worried about Sang Sang, who was left alone in the courtyard, so he quickly finished his investigation. He continued to deepen the map he had just drawn in his mind as he walked to the small courtyard. There was an inconspicuous stream about 100 feet away from the small courtyard. There were some green trees by the stream. He walked to a tree and looked at the direction of the small courtyard. After making sure that Sang Sang was fine, he sat down by the tree and lowered his head tiredly. One autumn in the Lank Temple, one autumn in the wilderness, and then they came to Chaoyang City. For more than 100 days, he had been extremely nervous and anxious. Although he could rest physically, he did not have the chance to relax, not even for a moment. Ever since he left Chang and when he was a child, he had been struggling on the edge of life and death. Whether in Min Mountain or in the wilderness, he was always in a state of mental tension. But at that time, there was always a chance for him to relax, whether it was drinking or singing by the fire. However, now he and Sang Sang were so lonely. Facing the overwhelming pressure of the whole world, there was no chance for them to vent their stress. Ning Ke thought that Sang Sang had sensed his abnormal state of mind, so she tried to make him relax by being cute and bickering. He was also very cooperative, but it still could not improve his current mental state. The string in his mind had been broken to the extreme today and could break at any time. He picked up a stone from the stream bank and held it tightly. Then he slowly exerted force. After a long time he released his palm. The stone in his palm had already been crushed into several pieces of gravel. Then he stood up and gave a heavy blow to the green tree. He wanted to learn from a certain article in his memory and use this method to relieve the heavy pressure, so that when he returned to the small courtyard, he could face Sang Sang with the calmest expression and the most gentle attitude. There was always a gap between reality and ideal. Ning Ke looked at the tree in front of him and his fist that had silently sunk into the hard trunk of the tree. He slightly raised his eyebrows and slightly opened his mouth. It was hard to tell whether he was crying or laughing. When he returned to the small courtyard, he had already calmed down. He groped under the quilt in the dark and hugged Sang Sang's slightly cold body. He leaned his face against the back of her neck and deeply sniffed. He said, "Hurry up and sleep." Sang Sang felt a little wet behind her neck. She turned around and looked into his eyes. But she saw nothing but calmness and warmth in his eyes. She whispered, "You're crying?" Ning Ke smiled and said, "Have you ever seen me cry for so many years?" Sang Sang buried her head in his arms and said, "Did mentioning Miss Shanshan remind you of those things and make you feel more regretful and sad? Is that why you're sad?" This was something they often did these days. But Ning Ke was not in the mood, so he just silently held her in his arms and gently stroked her back, conveying the warmth of his palm. Sang Sang was silent for a long time and suddenly said, "Am I very stupid?" Ning Ke asked, "Why are you stupid?" Sang Sang raised her head and looked at him. She said, "I'm not cute, but I want to pretend to be cute to make you happy. I pretend to be ugly and sometimes I even pretend to be unreasonable." Ning Ke looked at her and said, "You're cute?" Sang Sang whispered, "Why am I cute?" Ning Ke said, "You're the only girl I can love, so you're cute." Sang Sang smiled and said, so mushy, so sour. Ning Ke also smiled and said, Pippi taught me this sentence. Sang Sang was still smiling, but tears had wet her cheeks. Ning Ke reached out and flicked the tears off her face. He said, I haven't seen you cry since you were 5 years old. Sang Sang said, I cried once a few years ago, the night I left the old brush pen shop. Ning Ke said, don't cry in the future. Sang Sang lowered her head and gently hummed. Ning Ke's lips fell on her smooth forehead and then moved down to her lips. Sang Sang slightly opened her eyes and slightly parted her lips. Ning Ke hugged her tightly and kissed her quietly and attentively, as if he wanted to completely press her thin body into his. Only in this way could he prevent her from being seen and taken away by others. Sang Sang was 16 years old this year. Although she was thin, she had grown into a young girl and had her own charm. Ning Ke put his hands into her clothes and gently stroked them. Sang Sang whispered, let's have a baby. When you recover. Ning Ke looked at her seemingly transparent eyes and said, what if I can't recover? We'll leave Chaiyang City in 2 days. We'll think about it after we find a safe place. But where is the real safe place? The academy? If we can't go back to the academy, then a place without people is the safest place. The clouds in the sky became bigger and thicker. The shadows cast by the clouds had already shrouded most of Chaiyang City. When the sun rose, Chaiyang City welcomed a very short moment of morning light. Then, as the sun rose above the clouds, the city fell into gloomy weather again. Since last night, thousands of soldiers of the Yueluan kingdom, led by the ascetic monks of the Buddhism sect, had searched every street in Chaiyang City under the clouds. This time the search was carried out very carefully. No one dared to be careless. Every house was knocked on, including water tanks and grain cellars. Only after Li Zhang and the 3 neighbors confirmed that there were no outsiders living in the house, would they stick a piece of red paper on the door to indicate that there was no problem. Although Chaiyang City was large under the shadow of the clouds, with so many people searching from house to house and gradually eliminating the suspicion, the 2 people hiding under the clouds would be found at some point. That moment came earlier than everyone had expected. Neither Master Chi Mei of Shenkong Temple nor Luo Kadi and his 18 West Hill Divine Guards had expected it. An ascetic monk from Shenkong Temple was leading a dozen soldiers to search along a stream. Suddenly, a black crow appeared on a withered tree in front of him. The ascetic monk looked at the crow and frowned slightly. He waved his hand intending to drive it away. However, the black crow did not seem to be afraid of him. Instead, it cawed at him several times. After a few caws, the black crow left the branch and flew around the ascetic monk's head 3 times. Then it flew upstream and landed on another tree about 100 feet away. It cawed a few more times. Cultivators in the world were basically believers of Haotian. Although the disciples of the Buddhism sect worshipped Buddha, they believed in those things in the unseen world. Seeing the strange behavior of the black crow, the ascetic monk's expression became serious. He signaled the dozen soldiers to search where they were and then followed the black crow to the north of the stream. After walking for about a few miles and about 5 or 6 streets, the ascetic monk saw the black crow fly into a small courtyard about 100 feet away from the stream. His expression changed slightly. Then the ascetic monk's gaze fell on a green tree in front of him. He saw a clear fist-shaped hole in the hard trunk. His pupils shrank and his expression changed. He suddenly thought that if the 2 people in the small courtyard were really those 2 people of legend, then his Diana heart would probably be sensed by them in an instant due to his fear. Thinking of this, he actually concentrated his Diana heart and calmed his mind, forcefully expelling everything he had seen and guessed from his mind. The ascetic monk put his palms together. He was expressionless and did not think. Like a muddle-headed clay statue, he slowly walked away from the stream. He passed through the narrow alley and followed his instincts in the depths of his consciousness to walk somewhere. He maintained this state and walked through several streets. Whether it was the shouts of his fellow disciples or the strange looks of the soldiers, they could not stop him until he slowly walked into the White Tower Temple. The bell of the White Tower Temple woke the ascetic monk from his unconscious state. Looking at his fellow disciples who had surrounded him, his eyes were filled with confusion. Then he suddenly woke up and showed endless fear. With a puff, he spat out blood and said weakly, "Found it?" Luo Kadi looked at the small courtyard in the distance. His tall and sturdy body did not tremble in the slightest, and there was no emotion on his stone-like face. His eyes were burning with battle intent, as if he wanted to burn everything he saw into ashes. 18 West Hill Divine Guards, wearing red cloaks, stood solemnly on both sides of him. They carried God-given long swords. Looking at the width of the scabbards, One could imagine how heavy these God-given long swords were. Master Chi Mei stood beside Luo Kadi and looked quietly at the small courtyard in the distance. After a long silence, he said, "Who would have thought that the daughter of Yama would be hiding in Chaoyang City?" The two powerhouses stood 2 streets away from the small courtyard. They maintained this distance because the murderous intent on them was too strong. It was so strong that they could not hide it even with their state. Chapter 3, Strive for 1:30. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 6:23. Luo Kadi said expressionlessly, "What's the point of us standing here like this? Are we waiting for Ning Ke to come out or for Ning Ke to leave? If we can only watch, why did we come all the way to the Yueluan kingdom? If we are here to take action, why don't we take action? Why do we have to wait here?" Master Chi Mei said calmly, "Buddha is merciful, but there are also times when Vajra is angry. Since we are here, we are not here to watch them leave, but to watch the daughter of Yama die. As for waiting, the entire human world has been waiting for more than a year. What's the point of waiting a little longer?" Luo Kadi said, "Waiting for who?" Chi Mei said, "Waiting for the chief preaching monk to enter the city. According to the distance, it should be soon." Luo Kadi's expression froze. He thought to himself, "Yesterday you said that the chief preaching monk would not take action. Why did you say that the chief preaching monk was entering the city now?" He could not help but say in a cold voice, "Ning Ke can't leave Chaoyang City with just us." Chi Mei looked up at Luo Kadi's eyes and said with a smile, "Have you noticed that since we knew that Ning Ke was hiding in this small courtyard in the White Tower Temple, we have been talking more?" Luo Kadi raised his eyebrows slightly and said in a low voice, "So what?" Chi Mei sighed and said, "This shows that we are all a little nervous now." Luo Kadi said, "You are the chief monk of the Hall of Respect of Shenkong Temple, and I am the commander of the Divine Guards of the West Hill Divine Palace. We are both above Ning Ke in terms of strength and state. Moreover, the Hierarch Lord and the chief preaching monk chose us to kill the daughter of Yama. You and I both understand the reason. Even if Ning Ke is the core disciple of the headmaster of academy, how can he escape? The more you explain, the more nervous you are. I am willing to admit it because it is not shameful. According to the time in the human world, Ning Ke has only been in the knowing destiny state for less than half a year. Logically he can't beat us. But you should also know that from the time he defeated Prince Long Qing and entered the second floor of the academy to the many things that happened later, it is hard to find any reason from this young man." Master Chi Mei said indifferently, "The most important thing is that although the daughter of Yama has not recovered from her serious illness and her body is weak, at the last moment, how can you be sure that she can't shine as brightly as she did at the Snow Lake in Chang'an?" Luo Kadi was silent. He felt that his emotions were slightly agitated. He took a deep breath. This breath was extremely domineering. His chest was like a mountain rising from the plains, swelling up. At this moment his expression suddenly changed. The small courtyard in the distance was still quiet. He did not see anyone, nor did he see any movement, but he felt an extremely strong sense of danger. Luo Kadi let out a shrill howl, and stomped his right foot heavily on the ground. His stomp caused the ground to shatter into pieces. Borrowing the huge recoil force, he fell backwards without any hesitation. At this moment he let out a shrill howl, not only to warn the people around him, but also because he was taking a deep breath at this moment. His chest and abdomen were filled with countless air. If he did not release these air in the shortest time possible, then he would not be able to obtain the fastest speed. Once he was attacked, it was very likely that he would lose his chi and be seriously injured. At the same time when Luo Kadi's howl sounded, an extremely round small hole suddenly appeared on the wooden door of the small courtyard in the distance. The hole was no more than 3 fingers wide, and no splinters of wood could be seen. It appeared silently and strangely. The dark and sharp iron arrow ignored time, traversing a distance of dozens of feet and arriving in front of Luo Kadi. Ning Ke had aimed at the moment when Luo Kadi took a deep breath to shoot the arrow. How could he let him dodge it? The dark iron arrow shot Luo Kadi's left shoulder. It was obviously just an arrow, but the effect it produced was like a big hammer falling from the sky and smashing on a majestic mountain peak, making a thunderous sound. An extremely powerful talisman suddenly appeared on the armor under Luo Kadi's cloak. The surface of the armor flashed with extremely thin golden lines, trying to block the iron arrow outside of the armor. The armor he was wearing was a divine talisman armor jointly made by the divine talisman masters of the West Hill Divine Palace and the Ministry of Works of the South Jin Kingdom. Even in the entire West Hill Divine Palace, there were only 3 armors of this level, and they were only slightly weaker than the armor that Xiahou wore. If not for the Hierarch Lord's trust in him, he would not have been qualified to wear it. The reason why Luo Kadi looked down on Ning Ke was because he believed that Ning Ke's most powerful weapon, the primordial 13 arrows, could not pose any threat to him. However, before the strange thin round arrow hole appeared on the door of the small courtyard, when he had just sensed the strong sense of danger, he knew that he was wrong. At the Lake of Winter, Ning Ke was only in the upper state of see-through. At that time, the iron arrow in his hand could already make Xiahou embarrassed. Later, in front of the Red Lotus Temple, he shot Long Qing until he exploded his natal energy. Now that he had entered the knowing destiny state, his iron arrow could even make people like Qin Yan and Yi Su feel a little afraid, not to mention Luo Kadi. The iron arrow stabbed into the armor fiercely. The tail of the arrow trembled at a high speed, and the sharp arrowhead kept spinning, tearing a hole in the divine talisman armor that was glowing with golden light. Then it continued to smash Luo Kadi's protective genuine qi, and suddenly penetrated deep. Luo Kadi fell heavily on the ground like a mountain collapsing, and countless smoke and dust splashed. There was a horrifying big hole in his armor. The inside of the hole was a mess of flesh and blood, and even the bones could be seen. Countless amounts of blood spurted out of the hole like a waterfall. As the commander of the West Hill Divine Palace, he had gone through countless battles over the past decades and had incomparably rich combat experience. That was why he could sense the danger in advance before Ning Ke shot the arrow. He forced out his qi, like a collapsing jade mountain, and did not let the terrible iron arrow hit his heart. Even so, this arrogant bigwig of the West Hill Divine Palace was still seriously injured. If he was not the most powerful martial cultivator, and if he was not wearing the divine talisman armor given to him by the Hierarch Lord, even if it was only his left shoulder that was hit by the arrow, his left arm would probably be broken, and he would no longer be able to fight today. Luo Kadi lay on the ground. His tall and sturdy body was surrounded by rocks and soil that had been smashed into the air. Looking at him, he looked like a toppled mountain peak. Blood gushed out from his left shoulder like a turbulent waterfall and stream in the mountain peak. He looked at the thick layer of dark clouds in the sky, and his face became extremely pale. His eyes revealed an extremely violent desire to fight and anger. He slammed his right hand on the ground, and with a roar, he bounced up and rushed towards the small courtyard in the distance. The power of the primordial 13 arrows was beyond his imagination, but after all, it did not kill him. He believed that as long as he moved, the person in the small courtyard would not be able to aim at his vital parts such as his head and face. As long as he could hold on for more than 1,000 feet and get close to the small courtyard, he would definitely be able to kill that hateful guy. The 18 West Hill Divine Guards held the hilts of their swords and followed Luo Kadi to the small courtyard. Under the dark clouds, only their red cloaks could be seen fluttering, and their momentum was extremely majestic and shocking. It looked like thousands of men and horses. Luo Kadi, who was smashing towards the small courtyard like a mountain, and the 18 West Hill Divine Guards who followed closely behind him did not encounter the terrifying iron arrow sniping that they had imagined. This was because there was someone in the field who had a much faster reaction and speed than them. Just as Luo Kadi's roar came out of his lips, and the moment a strange arrow hole appeared on the wooden door of the small courtyard, Master Qi Mei moved. The straw sandals on his feet suddenly burst into countless pieces of dust. His body dragged a residual shadow, and in a few breaths, he swept to the door of the small courtyard. His body movement was as fast as the wind in the wilderness, which was extremely shocking. At that moment, when Qi Mei heard Luo Kadi's roar, he could not confirm that the target of the first iron arrow was Luo Kadi. However, he still did not avoid it. Instead, he swept to the small courtyard at the fastest speed. This was indeed an extremely risky gamble. But as long as he got closer to the small courtyard and shortened the distance between them, he could make the opponent's most powerful primordial 13 arrows lose most of its power. In order to kill the daughter of Yama, Qi Mei did not hesitate to fall into the netherworld. Faced with such a good opportunity, how would he be afraid to gamble? Qi Mei swept to the door of the small courtyard. His bare feet stepped heavily on the stone steps in front of the door, causing cracks to appear. His body stopped abruptly, and then without stopping, he flicked his monk's sleeves and hit the door of the courtyard. In the eyes of ordinary people, the most powerful skill of a cultivator was the sword-riding skill, which could attack from a very long distance. However, for those cultivators who really cultivated to the highest level, many people would return to their own bodies at the same time, whether it was the sword Garrett of South Jin Kingdom or the ascetic monks of Shenkong Temple. Chi Mei's monk sleeves seemed ordinary, but in fact they were mixed with countless chi of heaven and earth. With a flick, the power was like a boulder smashing out. In the cracking sound, the wooden door of the courtyard suddenly broke into countless pieces and shot toward the courtyard. This monk's sleeves were very experienced. Even if Ning Kei was behind the courtyard door with the iron bow ready to shoot, facing the countless pieces of wood flying toward him, he could only temporarily avoid it. As long as he could buy some time, Chi Mei would be able to get close to him. At this moment, the courtyard wall on the right side of the courtyard door suddenly collapsed. Dozens of bricks fell and splashed like rain. The old plaster smeared in the cracks of the bricks was shaken into fine dust like smoke and fog. Ning Kei's figure swept out from the rain of bricks and dust. He held the padao tightly in both hands and slashed at Chi Mei's back like lightning. At this time, Chi Mei had just retracted his monk's sleeves. The courtyard door had turned into countless pieces and was shooting. However, not to mention him, even Luo Kadi and the 18 West Hill Divine Guards, who were pouncing over like tigers, did not expect that Ning Kei was not behind the courtyard door. Instead, he broke through the wall and came out unexpectedly. The heavy padao cut through the air at high speed. However, because the speed was too fast, the shrill sound of the blade rubbing against the air was restrained in the momentum of the padao. It seemed so quiet. In addition, the dark shadow of the padao's gray blade made people feel that this padao did not come from the human world, but from the underworld. The sharp padao fell on Chi Mei's back, making a strange sound as if it had hit a broken piece of cotton. Chi Mei's back magically trembled violently. The muscles on his back seemed to have a life of their own. Some places began to relax and some places began to tighten. When the strength of these muscles came together, it became a tough dam that could stop a 1,000-year flood. It wanted to clamp or block the padao that was rushing at his body like a flood. Ning Kei felt a strange force coming from the hilt of the padao, but he did not care about it. He shouted and the great spirit gushed out. The padao cut through the strange force and dragged the monk's neck all the way to his waist. There was a tearing sound. Chi Mei's monk robe was torn, and an extremely deep wound appeared under the robe. Blood was like a flood that overflowed the dam, overflowing from the horrible wound. 201211230410 minor repair. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to cast a recommendation vote or a monthly vote. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 624. The blade was dragged on Master Chi Mei's back. In a very short period of time, there were many slight sounds of the blade rubbing against the bones. One could imagine what kind of pain Chi Mei was suffering. However, there was no change in the expression on his face. He was extremely calm, as if the padao in Ning Kei's hand was not cutting his own body, but the bark of a tree by the stream. At the moment when Ning Kei's padao was about to reach its end, he turned around and let the blood splatter in the air. He stretched out his hands and slapped towards Ning Kei's face. Ning Kei did not know who this middle-aged monk was. That was why his first iron arrow was shot at Luo Kadi, whom he knew and was wary of. However, since this middle-aged monk was qualified to stand with Luo Kadi, he must be a bigwig from the Buddhism sect, or even a powerhouse like Master Buishu from the Shenkong Temple. That was why he did not hold back. Even when the padao slashed the other party's back, he did not let his guard down. He keenly noticed that although the padao in his hand had left a terrible wound on the monk's back, the padao's power had been largely neutralized by the monk's strange trembling defense. The blade had only cut through the skin and flesh, but had not been able to cut through the other party's bones, much less injure the other party's internal organs. Since that was the case, the middle-aged monk's counterattack was naturally within his expectations. When the two pairs of slightly thin and branch-like palms attacked his face, he had already reacted. The padao in his hand rose from a low altitude and slashed horizontally from the left. With a majestic great spirit, it slashed towards the other party's body again. The blade whistled as it cut through the air. The sound was extremely shrill. Although it made a sound, its power was not much weaker than the first strike that broke through the wall. The expression on Chi Mei's face grew calmer. The two palms that were slapping towards Ning Kei's face suddenly spread out in the air. Like a shepherd boy playing a flute, they stretched towards both sides and were about to go towards the blade that was coming towards his eyes. Ning Kei shivered slightly. He did not believe that this powerful middle-aged monk was an idiot. Since the other party dared to use his bare hands to catch his padao, his hands were naturally extraordinary. In a split second, he saw the edges of the middle-aged monk's hands glowing with a golden luster. He could not help but think of the old monk he met in the depths of the wilderness. At that time, when Ning Ke shot an arrow, the old monk's left hand glowed with a golden luster and took the primordial 13 arrow head-on. Then it shattered. Recalling the scene at that time, Ning Ke believed that the middle-aged monk would not be able to use his palms to block the full force of his great spirit. The momentum of the knife was not hindered at all. Instead, it became more ferocious and continued to chop down. With a light snap, Master Chi Mei's right pinky finger touched the blade of the padao. Ning Ke only felt a strong force passing from the blade to the hilt, and then to his palm. There were a few more light sounds. The remaining 4 fingers of Master Chi Mei's right hand fell on the blade one by one, like playing a flute. It looked elegant and refined, but in fact, it was as fast as lightning. When all 5 fingers of Master Chi Mei's right hand fell on the blade, the golden luster on the edge of his palm suddenly became stronger. Then, it disappeared in a very short period of time. Nothing unusual could be seen. 5 vigorous forces were poured into the heavy and solid blade of the padao along with the 5 finger presses. Then they attacked Ning Ke's body. The blade buzzed and his body trembled slightly. The crystal water droplet condensed from the great spirit in Ning Ke's body seemed to feel some kind of threat. It did not wait for the psyche power to summon it. Instead, it spun rapidly and transmitted countless great spirit to his arms, making them look like they were made of iron. He held the hilt and continued to cut horizontally. The momentum of the knife was extremely strong. At this time, the sharp blade was only a few inches away from Master Chi Mei's cheek. It was also at this time that his left hand finally touched Ning Ke's blade. Master Chi Mei's left hand only had 2 fingers, the thumb and the index finger. There were only 7 fingers on both hands. Once they were spread out, they looked like 7 green peaches. That was why the master's Buddhist name was Chi Mei. Although he only had 2 fingers, they were more useful and powerful than the 2 hands of most people in the world. This had nothing to do with frequent use. It was only related to the firmness of his Zen heart and his past stories. The thumb of Master Chi Mei's left hand fell on the blade without being cut. He did not use the posture of pressing the hole with his right hand. Instead, he gently lifted the blade as if he was carefully and cautiously carrying a flute. Just at the moment when the thumb gently lifted the blade, Ning Ke felt a strong force, like a tide that was dozens of feet high, slapping towards him along the blade. His body trembled violently, like the moss on the reef in the tide. He did not know when it would be washed away. Master Chi Mei's last index finger also fell on the blade. It was in the opposite direction of the thumb, lifting the other side of the blade. It was still the movement of carrying a flute, gentle and calm. At this time, the blade was still an inch away from his face, but it was difficult to move any further. The eminent monk of the Shenkong temple held the padao with 7 fingers, like holding a flute, ready to lower his head and play it gently. The scene was elegant, but in fact it was very dangerous. An even more ferocious tide followed closely behind the first tide and slammed towards the black reef on the shore. The moss on the reef trembled and was already beginning to peel off. Ning Ke only felt a tearing pain in his chest. There were signs of turbulence in his ocean of chi, and he spat out a mouthful of blood. The blood that he spat out turned into a blood mist, followed by his shout. Ning Ke forced out all the great spirit in his body. An extremely gorgeous golden light spurted out from the padao, instantly burning the blood mist and hitting Chi Mei's face. Chi Mei closed his eyes, and a light breath of Buddha fell in front of him. The Haotian divine light that spurted out from the padao in Ning Ke's hand purified the breath of Buddha in a very short period of time. Chi Mei took a step back, but his hands were still holding the padao gently and refused to let go. So, he was no longer holding the flute and wanted to blow it. Instead, he was like a naughty shepherd boy who wanted to snatch the flute from his companion. Of course, Ning Ke would not let this powerful monk snatch his padao away. The little finger of his left hand quietly flicked out. He cast the fastest fire talisman, and it burned between the 2 of them. It usually took a while for a talisman master to cast a talisman, unless it was the infinitive talisman. Chi Mei did not expect that Ning Ke cast this fire talisman at such an amazing speed. He had to let go of his fingers and take another step back. From Chang'an to Chaoyang City, the talisman that Ning Ke wrote the most in his life was the fire talisman. The talisman that he used the most was also the fire talisman because Sang Sang was afraid of the cold. As the saying goes, practice makes perfect. When it came to the speed of casting the fire talisman, not to mention Mo Shanshan in the past, even if Master Yensei came back to life, there was no way to compare with him. The fire talisman turned into a fierce fireball, burning fiercely between him and Chi Mei. It was like a ball of lightning which looked particularly terrifying. But what was really terrifying was actually the action that Ning Ke made when casting the talisman. He squatted down. When Chi Mei let go of his fingers and stepped back, the padao in his hand regained its freedom. As he squatted down, it slammed heavily, brushed past Chi Mei's waist, and fiercely chopped down between his thigh and abdomen. With a hissing sound, Chi Mei's monk robe was suddenly torn, and a deep knife wound appeared between his groin. Although he still used that magical method to remove most of the knife's momentum at the moment when the knife was about to touch his body, Ning Ke chose that place to cut the knife for a deeper reason. There were a lot of blood vessels in the groin. Once it was slightly ruptured, blood would gush out. The lower half of Master Chi Mei's body was instantly wet with blood. The blood that gushed out from his groin began to flow down his naked thigh. Coupled with his eyebrows that were burnt by the fire talisman, he looked extremely miserable. Looking miserable did not mean that he had lost his combat power. If an ordinary cultivator was hit by these two knives, especially the second one, he would definitely die from excessive blood loss. But judging from the previous knife, this middle-aged monk might still have some tricks. So Ning Ke did not hesitate. He held the hilt with both hands, threw himself forward, and fiercely stabbed the other party's lower abdomen. Such a fierce bladesmanship, especially this stab, he used the great river sword style of the Sage of Sword, Lu Bai. Even if Chi Mei was the president of the Hall of Respect of Shenkong Temple, he still could not avoid it. It was only a matter of whether he could survive or not. Unfortunately for Ning Ke, today the Buddhism and Taoism sects had ambushed him in Sangsang. Naturally, the middle-aged monk would not come alone. There were also Luo Kadi and the 18 West Hill Divine Guards. What made him feel even more regretful was that Luo Kadi had a burly figure, but his speed was beyond his calculation. Just as the padao in his hand had pierced the middle-aged monk's lower abdomen, Luo Kadi's sword arrived. Luo Kadi's sword was very special. Compared to ordinary swords, it was many times thicker. If it were not for the brilliant golden light, the gemstone-like blade and the flickering talisman lines, it would look like an iron rod. When the sword slashed toward Ning Ke's back, the front of the small courtyard, which had become a little dark and bloody due to the smoke and blood, suddenly became extremely bright. The golden sword seemed to exude an extravagant aura. Ning Ke was in a half-squatting position at this time. He felt the strong wind coming from behind and had no time to dodge. He hurriedly pulled back his knife, and then sat down on the ground to protect his back. Then he raised his knife to meet the attack. His padao was designed by the Academy's fourth brother and meticulously made by the sixth brother. It was made up of 3 knives and was the heaviest and strongest. However, it looked like it was not heavier than Luo Kadi's sword. As for its dull and smooth appearance, it looked more like trash compared to Luo Kadi's dazzling sword. The plain padao and the gorgeous golden sword finally met. There was a loud bang. Smoke and dust rose. The Yueluan Kingdom's soldier at the end of the street only felt a buzz in his head. His legs went weak and he fell down. Ning Ke's face was slightly pale. His hands that were holding the hilt trembled violently. As for the ground he was sitting on, it had already cracked like a spider web. Countless bricks and sand were scattered everywhere. Luo Kadi roared and slashed again with his sword. Ning Ke raised his knife to meet the attack again. He only felt an irresistible force pressing down on his body along the padao, as if it would not stop until he was pressed into the cracked ground. At this time, Ning Ke sat on the ground and was in an extremely passive position. Even if he could use the padao in his hand to make it impenetrable, he could only let Luo Kadi wave his gorgeous golden sword and continuously slash at him. If this continued for a while, he would be defeated. Even if he could hold on for a longer period of time, it would be meaningless, because there was still the middle-aged monk in the field. A trace of ruthlessness flashed across Ning Ke's face. Taking advantage of the extremely short moment when Luo Kadi's golden sword swung back and gathered strength again, he forced his right foot to the bottom of his left leg and then stood up abruptly. At this time, Luo Kadi's third sword had already arrived. Ning Ke's body was unstable at this time, especially with the padao hanging down. There was no way he could block it. However, unexpectedly, he reached out his left hand and held the back of the tip of the padao. He pushed it straight forward, which was equivalent to using the strength of 2 hands to block the third golden sword. With a soft sound, Ning Ke slapped the padao with his left hand and twisted his right wrist. The heavy padao seemed to have turned into a nimble poisonous snake. In an instant, it stabbed Luo Kadi's left shoulder, which was still bleeding, and then instantly flashed back. Luo Kadi did not expect that Ning Ke would still be able to stand up in a situation where he had the absolute advantage. He even allowed Ning Ke to stab him. Even though his injury did not worsen, the feeling of humiliation and anger made him forget everything else. He did not even care about his chest and abdomen. With a roar, he held the sword with both hands and slashed at Ning Ke. The golden sword waved in the air, creating a golden ray of light that dazzled the eyes. Hidden within it was the aura of an emperor's wealth, but it represented that this was Luo Kedi's most powerful sword. If Ning Ke was a man of sacrifice, he could completely ignore this sword and directly stab Luo Kedi's throat. In that case, no matter how strong the armor on Luo Kedi's body was, there was only death for him. However, almost at the same time, his head would definitely be chopped in half by this powerful golden sword. At this time, Luo Kedi was so crazy that he did not care about his own life and death. That was why he could slash out such a powerful sword. However, Ning Ke did not want to die and had to protect his back, so he could only choose to take it head-on. Another thunderous sound rang out. The walls of the small courtyard, which were already badly damaged, were shaken by the strong wind and collapsed. And at this moment, Luo Kedi slashed again with his sword. Luo Kedi was a martial arts cultivator from the West Hill Divine Palace. The golden sword in his hand was a divine weapon of the Divine Hall. Together with the sword and in a state of selflessness, his strength was astonishing and his fighting intent was even more crazy. Ning Ke had cultivated the Great Spirit for many years and his body was no longer that of an ordinary person. He had extremely powerful strength. However, he could not forget his own life and death at this time, nor could he fight with his body movements. He was extremely passive and suppressed to the point that he could only take it head-on. The brilliant golden sword and the simple iron sword slashed at each other without any fancy moves. They separated and then slashed at each other again. In an extremely short period of time, no one knew how many times they had collided. More than 10 sounds of collision exploded in the street like thunder. The soldiers of the Yueluan kingdom around the street could no longer stand. The warhorses neighed in fear and ran in all directions. They only wanted to get as far away from this terrifying place as possible. This battle didn't look like a battle between cultivators at all. It was more like two extremely powerful generals on the battlefield, carrying heavy weapons, carrying out an incomparably valiant charge at each other. Ning Ke's legs began to tremble. He realized that the strength of the Divine Guard commander of the West Hill Divine Palace was so terrifying that it exceeded his own. It was even not much weaker than Xiahou at his peak. A stream of blood flowed from the corner of his mouth. His internal organs must have been severely shaken and he had internal injuries. However, his eyes were still calm or even indifferent. He was like a young male tiger fighting in the wilderness. Even if he was injured and seemed to be in danger, he would never give up the thought of killing his enemy until the last moment. Luo Kedi raised his golden sword again. This time his arm trembled slightly. Although Ning Ke was on the verge of collapsing under the pressure of his golden swords, he did not feel good either. Every time the swords collided, the great spirit from the blade also caused him great pain. Most importantly, his left shoulder had already been shot by the primordial 13 arrow before the battle started. No matter how serious the injury was, he could ignore it as he was already crazy. However, he could not make the impact disappear. Ning Ke noticed the trembling of Luo Kedi's right hand. His eyes lit up and he shouted, "Open the umbrella." The big black umbrella opened in front of him. The big black umbrella was very clean now, but also very broken. There were many holes on the surface of the umbrella. It looked like the clothes of a beggar attending a wedding. It was sad. Ning Ke stretched out his left hand like lightning and held the handle of the big black umbrella. At this moment, Luo Kedi's golden sword slashed down again. Just like the previous dozen times, the crazed commander of the Divine Guards wanted to hack Ning Ke to death. He knew that he could hack Ning Ke to death. Therefore, even if there was a big black umbrella in front of him, he would still hack at Ning Quebec. The golden sword slashed heavily on the big black umbrella. The surface of the big black umbrella suddenly caved in, but it was not cut open. Although it was a broken big black umbrella, it could not be easily cut open by a sword. No matter how dazzling the sword was, it was after all not the Buddha's light left by Buddha. The big black umbrella was still the best defensive weapon in the world. At this moment, it was the shield in Ning Ke's hand. In the previous dozen times when facing Luo Kedi's golden sword, Ning Ke used the padao in his hand to cut. Only in this way could he compete with his opponent in strength. But now the golden sword was blocked by the big black umbrella. Therefore this time Ning Ke did not slash out but stabbed out. The dull and unadorned padao pierced through the hole in the big black umbrella and stabbed towards the opposite side. With a soft sound, the blade pierced through Luo Kedi's throat. This seemingly casual slash broke through several layers of protective genuine qi and went straight for the vital part. Luo Kadi abandoned his sword and covered his bleeding throat. Like a madman, he frantically retreated in a daze. He screamed as he retreated. But his throat bone was broken at this time, so the sound of his screams was particularly strange and unpleasant. It was like the screams of the beasts in the wilderness who died because of pride. 201211230413 Minor repairs. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 625. The wooden door of the small courtyard was shattered, the wall was broken and smoke rose. The knife cut through the monk's robes and clashed with the sword many times. It seemed like a long time had passed, but in fact it was very short. Luo Kadi covered his bleeding throat and retreated desperately. The 18 West Hill Divine Guards had just rushed to the broken wall. They shouted angrily and raised their knives to attack Ning Quebec. The West Hill Divine Guards were the personal guards of the hierarch. They were much stronger than the ordinary cavalrymen of Divine Hall. If they were in the ordinary cultivation sects, they would be absolute masters. The knives in their hands were long and straight, and their bodies were engraved with complicated talisman lines. Every time they swung their knives, they could trigger the vibration of talisman and increase their strength. They were also known as the God-given long knives. 18 God-bestowed long swords fell on Ning Ke from all directions like a storm. Although the big black umbrella that Ning Ke held could block these swords, it could not cover the direction of the swords. Fortunately, he had a padao in his hand besides the big black umbrella. He pulled the padao back from the hole in the umbrella, held the umbrella in one hand and the knife in the other, and waved at the storm of knives. Pa 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 pa. The black umbrella padao and the 18 God-bestowed long swords clashed continuously in the air, producing either crisp or dull sounds. Following that, numerous sounds rang out in the field. There was the sound of metal breaking, the sound of sharp objects piercing through the air, the sound of blades tearing through flesh and blood, and the muffled sound of people enduring the pain. 4 God-given long knives broke in the middle. 3 West Hill Divine Guards had bloody wounds on their chests and abdomens. They retreated in panic. Ning Ke's hand holding the black umbrella was slightly torn, and there were 2 long wounds on his left leg. The God-given long knives with talisman meanings were extremely sharp. Even with his tough body he could not completely block them. The sharp tips of the broken God-given long knives whistled through the air and sputtered toward the streets outside the small courtyard. A Xiankong temple ascetic monk who had just rushed over was shot in the shoulder by a broken knife and fell to the ground with a pale face. There was also a broken knife that shot toward the middle-aged monk. He stretched out 2 fingers and calmly grasped the broken knife as if he was plucking a falling flower from the air. Then he walked toward Ning Quebec. His monk robes had long since become tattered, and his entire body was stained with blood. He looked extremely miserable, but his expression was extremely calm. What was shocking was that the 2 deep wounds on the monk's back and groin were no longer bleeding. Although there were still lacerations on the skin, the muscles on both sides of the wound were squeezing together and twisting slowly, as if they were healing. Other than his pale face, there were no signs of injury. Ning Ke had guessed that the monk must have some tricks up his sleeve, but he did not expect it to be so marvelous. Forcibly compressing muscles to stop the wound was shocking, but it was still imaginable. However, there were at least a few broken blood vessels in the wound on the monk's groin. How could he make those blood vessels grow back? What made him even more vigilant and uneasy was that when the middle-aged monk walked towards him, more than 100 archers from the Ueluan Kingdom army also entered the alley. He could clearly hear the sound of bowstrings being pulled. Ning Ke's pupils shrank slightly. Since he cultivated the Great Spirit, he was not afraid of ordinary arrows at all, not to mention that he was holding the big black umbrella in his hand. However, he was worried about his back. More than a dozen West Hill Divine Guards regrouped and followed the middle-aged monk to walk toward him. The archers around the alley also gradually entered their respective shooting positions. The atmosphere suddenly became extremely tense. Ning Ke took 3 steps back and stood in front of the remaining half of the broken wall. After breaking through the wall, he had been fighting at high speed. In the eyes of the people, he who was wearing the black uniform of the academy was just a black figure. It was only when he stood in front of the broken wall, in absolute stillness, that the people could clearly see his current situation. He was carrying a thin and weak little girl on his back. His waist and the little girl's thighs were tightly tied with ropes. No matter how they ran, the 2 of them would not be separated. Moreover, this kind of absolute tightness guaranteed that it would not affect his reaction and speed in battle. Master Chi Mei, the West Hill Divine Guards, the ascetic monks in the distance, and the archers of the Ueluan kingdom looked at this scene and immediately guessed the real identity of the thin little girl. They could not help but have very complicated feelings. Some people sighed with emotion, some people were extremely frightened, and some people were shocked speechless. Ning Ke held the big black umbrella in his left hand and the padao in his right. He looked at the middle-aged monk and the Westhill divine guards in front of him calmly and silently. Sang Sang carried a black iron bow on her back and had a bag tied to her waist. She leaned on his shoulder and looked very calm. Although they were heavily surrounded, there was no extra emotion on their faces. It was quiet in the field. Ning Ke and Sang Sang's calmness represented strength and terror. Whether it was Master Chi Mei or the Westhill divine guards, they all looked at the scene in front of them and subconsciously stopped. No one dared to shoot arrows. His black academy uniform trembled slightly and his chest kept moving up and down. Ning Ke did not make any sound of panting. In fact, he was extremely tired. It was only a very short battle, but it made him feel as tired as if he had been fighting for a whole day. Especially after colliding with Luo Kadi for more than 10 times, he showed signs of fatigue. Luo Kadi's last golden sword slashed heavily on the big black umbrella. The handle of the umbrella fell heavily and stabbed into his chest. That place was in pain. What was more troublesome was that he had suffered from internal injuries after taking 7 fingers from the middle-aged monk and more than 10 golden swords. At this time, the hand that was holding the hilt of the knife was trembling slightly. He loosened his right hand that was holding the hilt of the knife and then gripped it tightly again. In a very short period of time, he repeated this action 7 times to calm his state of mind and ease the fatigue in his wrist. Because the action was too fast, the hilt could not leave his hand at all. In fact, no one in the field had even noticed this. At the same time, he kept thinking very quickly. How could he get rid of the current predicament and the pursuit later? How could he get rid of the middle-aged monk in front of him? Luo Kadi was undoubtedly a very terrifying enemy. His strength was even above his own. Fortunately, this person had already suffered a very serious injury. Even if he could survive, he would certainly not be able to fight today. However, Ning Ke was clear that this did not mean that his strength had surpassed Luo Kadi. He had only used the hole in the big black umbrella and used a method that no one could imagine to defeat the opponent. If one were to think calmly enough, he would understand that this was a victory at the level of tactics, and not a comparison of strategic strength. And this middle-aged monk was even more powerful and terrifying than Luo Kadi. After Ning Ke cultivated the Great Spirit, his body movement was extremely fast. However, when he sneaked an attack on the other party earlier, he did not manage to kill him with one strike. Moreover, his body movement did not give him the upper hand. If this middle-aged monk continued to pursue him, what should he do? There were 2 serious mistakes in the first few chapters. I mixed up Dao Shi's father and Wu Dao's father. Apart from that, there is another problem. After I finish writing today, I will immediately correct it. I will solemnly apologize and reflect deeply. I will try to finish the next chapter before 12 o'clock. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 626. Ning Ke was vigilant and uneasy, but he did not know that Chi Mei was looking at him in front of the broken wall with even more complicated emotions. The 2 sects decided to ignore the academy and kill the daughter of Yama. Naturally, they had made sufficient investigation and preparation in advance. The absolute focus of attention was Ning Ke's strength and state. In the end, they came to a shocking and speechless conclusion. In the battle of the same state, this person was invincible. There had always been a legend in the cultivation world that a talisman master could basically crush cultivators of the same state, especially when the state was higher and higher. However, the 2 sects did not think that Ning Ke was invincible in the battle of the same state. After all, a legend was a legend and talisman masters were not good at fighting. But Ning Ke was very good at fighting and had countless powerful fighting methods. In the battle of the same state, if he kept a distance, the primordial 13 arrows was the most terrifying weapon in the world. It had a longer killing range than all flying swords. Unless he was facing a peerless powerhouse like the Sage of Sword Liu Bai, he could be invincible. If a cultivator chose to fight with Ning Ke in close combat, he had already been possessed by the devil due to his cultivation of the Great Spirit. His body was extremely tough and powerful. Sang Sang was best at close combat. If he wanted to fight with Ning Ke by controlling the chi of heaven and earth, he was already a divine talisman master and could seal all changes around him. If he wanted to fight with Ning Ke in psyche power, it was even more meaningless. Master Dao Shi died in Chang and City and Qin Yan returned without success in the Lank Temple. And if he wanted to fight with Ning Ke in terms of willpower or skills, who dared to say that they were more powerful and unpredictable than Yi Hongyu? These were things that Ning Ke had proven in the past battles. Even Cheng Ziqing of the Knowing Destiny State of the Sword Garret and Master Buishu of the Shenkong Temple were defeated by him. Although Mo Shanshan, the calligraphy addict, had helped him at that time. So they could not choose people to fight with Ning Ke based on their state. The two sects finally decided to let Yi Hongyu, Luo Kadi and Master Chi Mei of the Divine Priest of Judgment to lead the operation to kill the daughter of Yama. This was based on the previous analysis. Not to mention Yi Hongyu, who was used to being alone and had now gone to the swamp in the wilderness. Master Chi Mei and Luo Kadi were the best candidates to fight with Ning Quebec. Luo Kadi was a strong cultivator of martial arts, and Master Chi Mei was the eminent monk with the strongest close combat ability in Shenkong Temple. Although Ning Ke's close combat ability was also very strong, he had only cultivated the Great Spirit for a short period of time. No matter how one looked at it, it was impossible for him to surpass these two bigwigs in this aspect. Master Chi Mei had been chasing Ning Ke and Sang Sang from the depths of the wilderness to Chaiyang City. Before meeting them today he had been silent and calm because he also thought so. As long as they met, the story would end. However, he did not expect that just after he found Ning Ke and the daughter of Yama, Luo Kadi would be seriously injured before the daughter of Yama could even attack. If it were any other cultivator, they would naturally feel anxious and even have the thought of retreating in such a situation. However, Chi Mei was still calm because he believed that he could definitely make Ning Ke stay, or at least hold him back until the horse carriage entered Chaiyang City. Mr. 13's saber is so fast. Chi Mei glanced at the wound below his lower abdomen that was gradually healing but still looked terrible. Then he raised his head and looked at Ning Ke, who was in front of the broken wall. He said, "But you can't kill me?" Ning Ke's right hand that was holding the hilt slightly tightened. He looked at the middle-aged monk and said, "As long as you are a human, you can definitely be killed. The only difference is how many times you need to cut. I just want to know who you are." "I'm a poor monk, Chi Mei." "So you are a senior monk of the 7th generation in Shenkong Temple. It seems that you are Qin Yan's younger brother." Master Chi Mei looked at Sang Sang, who was behind Ning Ke, and said, "Mr. 13, do you really not pity the people in the world and insist on protecting the daughter of Yama? Even the headmaster of academy may not agree with you." Ning Ke said, "The headmaster did not say that what I am doing is wrong." Master Chi Mei said, "But the headmaster of academy did not say that what you are doing is right. The rules of the academy do not explicitly prohibit it, so you can do it." After a short pause, Ning Ke continued, "And even if the headmaster says that I am wrong, it will not affect my choice." Chi Mei sighed and said, "You are indeed an extraordinary person with a firm mind. However, it is a pity that neither I nor the people in Chaiyang City will allow you to leave with the daughter of Yama." Ning Ke looked at a tree in the distance. Luo Kadi was leaning against the tree, covered in blood. His right hand was tightly clutching his throat. There were some people around him who seemed to be treating him. "Originally, the two of you did have the ability to keep me here. However, it is a pity that Luo Kadi has been disabled. Now you cannot keep me here alone." Master Chi Mei said calmly, "If that is the case, why are you still here, Mr. 13? Ning Ke withdrew his gaze from the tree and looked at the powerful middle-aged monk in front of him. He said calmly and naturally, "I am thinking whether I should leave like this or kill you first." Master Chi Mei put his palms together and said expressionlessly, "I have said that you cannot kill me." Ning Ke said, "I have also said that as long as you are a human you can be killed. It just depends on how many cuts are needed." Master Chi Mei put down his right hand and looked at his left hand, which only had 2 fingers left. He said indifferently, "When I was young, I once asked myself the same question. How many cuts do I need to cut myself into countless pieces and then burn them for peace? I first cut my little finger, then my ring finger, and then my middle finger. However, when it came to this index finger, I found that no matter how many cuts I made, I could not cut it off." He looked up at Ning Ke and asked with a smile, "How many cuts do you need?" Ning Ke had seen Qin Yan's Dharmakaya of the Akalanatha in the Lank Temple. He had also seen the old monk's left palm glowing with a golden light before he died in the wilderness. He understood the power of the Buddhism sect's secret method. After a moment of silence, he said, "I once killed an old monk not far from the Bodhi tree. The one who died in your hands was the preaching monk." Master Chi Mei said, "The monk spent most of his life seeking wisdom in the vast Buddhist scriptures. He could not bear to waste his time and energy on external dharma, so his body only became a golden Buddha." "Sounds very powerful." Ning Ke looked at Chi Mei's palm and thought of the golden light that flashed on the monk's palm. He asked, "Is there anything stronger than a golden Buddha?" Master Chi Mei said, "There are thousands of Buddhism Dharma, but it is the same. The cultivation is to enter Buddhism through meditation and become a Buddha through the body. Both the body and mind are indestructible, and I have cultivated to become a Buddha through the body." You are indeed a Buddhist sublime being. You can even tell the enemy honestly. It is really admirable. Ning Ke did not look touched at all. He showed a slightly sarcastic smile and said, "And the enlightenment of a broken finger is indeed an excellent story. You should have told it longer and more details." Master Chi Mei was slightly shocked. He guessed that Ning Ke might have seen through his intentions. "Since you found out that you might not be able to keep me here, you have been delaying time. It seems that there is a big shot who is more terrible than you who has become a Buddha through the body coming to Chaiyang City soon." Ning Ke said, "I am very clear about my own state of strength. If I really fight empty-handed, I can't even beat you, let alone that big shot. So I can't let you continue to delay. The reason why I was willing to accompany you to talk about these things and listen to the story of the broken finger was that I also needed to rest and make some preparations. And I finally decided to kill you before leaving." As soon as he finished speaking without any warning, the sharp and dull padao turned into a gray thunderbolt. It broke through the air and slashed toward Chi Mei's throat. 7 fingers spread out in the air to catch the blade that seemed to be faster than lightning. Master Chi Mei was ready. Even if Ning Ke's padao cut into his chest, he would catch it. However, no one had expected that Ning Ke's padao would change abruptly. It converged like flowing water in front of Chi Mei, and then retracted. Suddenly, it turned into an iron hammer and smashed heavily on the ground. With the counterforce from the padao, Ning Ke bent his knees slightly, bent his body and broke through the air. He jumped onto the broken wall with Sang Sang on his back. He tiptoed on half of the broken bricks and swept toward the houses. At the beginning of the confrontation on the broken wall, Chi Mei's plan was to delay time, while Ning Ke's plan was to escape. He had never thought of killing this high monk of Shenkong Temple, regardless of whether he could do it or not. Even if he could, he would have to pay a very heavy price. How could he escape with Sang Sang at that time? Whether it was the conversation or the momentum, he was creating a kind of momentum and atmosphere of mutual destruction. But those were all fake. They were all preparations for the last moment of escape. Looking at the figure that swept over the broken wall, Chi Mei shouted and stretched his right arm forward. His body seemed to suddenly grow longer, and so did his arm. He slapped heavily toward Ning Ke's back. Sang Sang was carried on Ning Ke's back, and the direction of the palm was her body. When Chi Mei's palm fell, there was a trace of shame on his face. Although she was the daughter of Yama, she looked like a thin and sick little girl. It was not a glorious act to threaten Ning Ke with her, and it was not in line with the reputation of a high monk of Shenkong Temple. But other than that, he could not think of any other way to make Ning Ke stay. Ning Ke did not shout that the bald donkey was shameless and hypocritical, because he did not have time to shout those words. And those words were indeed meaningless. The person that the Buddhism and Taoism sects wanted to kill was Sang Sang. He was not forced to turn around and use his padao to protect Sang Sang as Chi Mei had expected. Thus, he was besieged by Chi Mei and more than a dozen West Hill Divine Guards who had already jumped into the air. Because he had already made preparations. In the previous conversation, Ning Ke told the truth at the end. He used the interval of the battle to make preparations under the broken wall. He believed that those preparations could help him and Sang Sang escape. The big black umbrella appeared in Sang Sang's hands, and she unfolded it to cover her back. There was a fu paper in the brick crack of the broken wall, and it quietly turned into a wisp of green smoke. Master Chi Mei struck with his palm, and the chi of heaven and earth around the small courtyard suddenly condensed. It fell with the palm, and its power was as heavy as a mountain. However, when it was still some distance away from the black umbrella, the chi of heaven and earth instantly collapsed. Countless extremely thin invisible lines appeared in front of the broken wall. Those lines were extremely sharp, as if they could cut everything in the world. It was the Jing Fu that Ning Ke had inherited from his master Yen Sei. A West Hill Divine Guard leaped into the air and chopped at Sang Sang's leg that was exposed outside the umbrella from the side. The God-given knife in his hand suddenly made a series of cracking sounds. The shimmering talisman lines on the surface of the knife seemed to have encountered something terrible, and they dimmed in fear. The knife was suddenly broken into 3 pieces. The rest of the West Hill Divine Guards who had leaped into the air to kill Ning Ke were alertly aware of the sharp cutting intent in the air in front of them. They forcibly lowered their bodies, barely stopped their forward momentum, and rolled around awkwardly. Master Chi Mei also noticed the sharp talisman intent, and instantly thought that it must be the Jing Fu. However, he did not retreat in fear like the West Hill Divine Guards. Instead, he continued to sweep over the broken wall with a determined look. With numerous soft sounds, at least 20 bloodlines appeared on Master Chi Mei's body and cheeks in an instant. The broken monk's robe was cut into hundreds of pieces and flew away. After the battle in the Lank Temple, both the Buddhism and Taoism sects knew that Ning Ke had become a divine talisman master and learned an extremely powerful divine talisman. In contrast, although his Jing Fu was also very powerful, it was still in the category of see-through realm. It was far from the effect of Master Yen Sei's Jing Fu, which could cut the sky and the earth. Master Chi Mei's body had already become a Buddha. The Jing Fu might seriously injure him, but as long as he did not die on the spot, he could always recover afterwards. Therefore he did not hesitate to rush over. If Ning Ke had used the unknown divine talisman in the cultivation world, he would not have dared to rush over even if his body had become a Buddha. However, he was sure that Ning Ke would not dare to use the divine talisman that consumed a lot of psyche power until the last desperate situation. If Ning Ke really used it at this time, it would be worth it even if he died. Master Chi Mei, with the determination to die for a just cause and the compassion of sacrificing himself to save the common people, rushed toward the sharp talisman intent in front of the broken wall. In an instant, blood was dripping again. However, as he had guessed, Ning Ke was not willing to hide the divine talisman in the Jing Fu. His feet finally stepped on the broken wall. At this time, Ning Ke had swept to the roof of a house more than 100 feet away with Sang Sang on his back. He was jumping to a small temple across the street. However, just as he jumped into the air, he suddenly twisted his waist and turned around. Unknowingly, his hands had already held the iron bow, and the iron arrow was already on the string. Master Chi Mei's expression suddenly changed and he flipped down from the broken wall. With a slight buzzing sound, the string sounded around the small courtyard. The iron arrow, which could kill gods and destroy Buddha, had already reached the broken wall before the string sounded, and passed by Master Chi Mei's ear. Master Chi Mei's earlobe was broken into bright red flesh powder and scattered in the air. The iron arrow did not stop. It blasted 2 horrible arrow holes in the chests and abdomens of the 2 West Hill Divine Guards, and then deeply shot into the ground, leaving only a dark arrow hole. The 2 West Hill Divine Guards did not make any sound and fell to the ground dead. Master Chi Mei looked at the figure that quickly passed through the eaves in the distance, and knew that he could no longer catch up with him. His face full of blood showed a very complicated expression. The next chapter, Fight for It Before 2:30. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 627. 2 famous powerhouses who had been in the knowing destiny state for many years could not do anything to a young man who had just entered the knowing destiny state. They could not even make him stay for a while. This fact was really shocking. Luo Kadi sat on the ground. His face was pale and his body was covered in blood. He was extremely weak and did not fall down by leaning against a tree trunk. Beside him, the imperial physician of the Yueluan kingdom and a priest from the West Hill Divine Palace were nervously treating him. His throat bone was broken and he had lost too much blood. His vision was a little blurred. When he saw Ning Ke jump up the broken wall to escape, he felt as if he saw another person. The great divine priest of judgment, Yi Hongyu. Before last spring, Luo Kadi's cultivation state had always been above Yi Hongyu's. However, during those years he had never dared to do anything to Yi Hongyu even though he had lusted after her and even wanted to humiliate and torture her. He did not even dare to challenge her face to face. Because he knew that even though his state was higher than Yi Hongyu's, if he really fought with her, he would definitely be the one to die. Luo Kadi had always thought that there was only one person like Yi Hongyu who was so strong that she could surpass the state and was so scary that he could not understand why. Until today, when he fought with Ning Ke, he realized that Ning Ke and Yi Hongyu were the same kind of people. The Hierarch Lord thought that Ning Ke was invincible in the same state, and it was very reasonable. Looking at the dark eaves that were long gone, Luo Kadi coughed painfully. The flesh on his neck burst open again, and even some white bone fragments splashed out. The imperial physician of the Yueluan kingdom and the priest from the West Hill Divine Palace were so scared that their faces were paler than his. They quickly continued to treat him. Luo Kadi thought bitterly, even if Ning Ke was invincible in the same state, he would still die if he met someone at the peak of the knowing destiny state. Moreover, the great divine priest of judgment was in the wilderness. How could he escape with the daughter of Yama? Master Chi Mei stood on the roof of the small temple across the street and looked around. He only saw the quiet Chaiyang city under the clouds. He could not see Ning Kei and the daughter of Yama. There was no expression on his face. The flesh on his cheeks that had been cut open by the Jing Fu looked extremely ferocious. However, there was a strange sense of solemnity and compassion. Master Chi Mei raised his head and looked at the thick dark clouds in the sky. He confirmed that the clouds had not moved, and knew that Ning Kei and the daughter of Yama were still in the city. I can't stop you by myself. What if hundreds of thousands of people in the city come together to stop you? The bell in the White Tower Temple rang and then spread to Chaiyang City. Compared to the usual peaceful and distant bell, the bell today seemed especially urgent. It rang non-stop as if it was urging something. In Chaiyang City, all the Buddhist temples, big or small, began to ring the bells when they heard the bell. The little monk in the robe pushed the bell hammer with difficulty. The thin old monk panted and hit the gong in his hand hard. Then the drums in the government offices of the Ueluan kingdom sounded. Then the anti-theft gongs in the streets and the night watchmen sounded the bamboo bangs in their hands. Bells, drums, gongs and clappers sounded all kinds of sounds in the streets and alleys of Chaiyang City. The people in the city came to the streets and talked about it. Then they learned the reason from the villagers or the monks. Their faces suddenly became extremely shocked, and then they were at a loss. Ning Kei ran quickly in the remote alley with Sang Sang on his back. He had no time to wipe the sweat on his forehead and the blood stains on the corners of his lips. The clear and deep sounds of the bell and drum were like notes of death, constantly drilling into his ears and making his footsteps a little heavy. But he did not stop at all. Running in broad daylight with Sang Sang on his back was extremely eye-catching. Many people had seen him, but he didn't find a secluded place to hide again, because there were too many eyes on the street and he couldn't find any chance. Besides, some bigwigs were about to enter Chaiyang City, so it was not a good choice to hide in the city. The most important thing was that the residents in the city had not reacted yet. They just watched him run in panic. No one came to stop him. He had to seize this very short time to escape from the city cloud. He had hidden in the city for the whole winter. He had made sufficient investigation and careful planning. He was very familiar with these remote streets and had already chosen an escape route. Although the Xiankong temple monk called Chi Mei was powerful and fast, he could not catch up with him if he did not want to become the target of the primordial 13 arrows. Once he got rid of the monk, escaped from Chaiyang City, and met with the big black horse, it would be difficult to find anyone in the world who could catch up with him and Sang Sang. Carrying Sang Sang on his back, he lowered his head and ran desperately. His feet kept stepping on the bluestone pavement of the street, making heavy crashing sounds. Because he was running so fast, he left a trail of dust under his feet. His black uniform fluttered in the wind like a flag. Sweat kept dripping from his face, brushing against his cheeks as they drifted backward. The big black horse and the carriage were hidden in the great green mountain in the north of Chaiyang City. In his plan to leave the city, he chose the west gate instead of the north gate. As he ran wildly, he was getting closer and closer to the west gate. He could even see the buildings there. His face finally showed a relaxed expression. However, at this moment his expression suddenly froze. He vaguely sensed an extremely powerful aura outside the west gate. At this moment, a powerful aura meant terror to him and Sang Sang. Ning Kei stamped his right foot heavily. His leather boots were already cracked and several cracks appeared on the bluestone pavement. He forced himself to stop running forward and felt a numbness in his right leg. Behind him, Sang Sang was shocked and her face turned pale. They were about to escape from Chaiyang City, but suddenly faced with a new and more serious situation. Most people would feel indignant and sad, and Ning Kei was no exception. However, it might take a while for others to choose to take the risk of leaving the west gate or choose another way. He did not even think about it. Without hesitation, he turned around and ran to the north of the city with Sang Sang on his back. Chaiyang City was a city without city walls. Therefore, there was no real city gate. It was just some non-temporary buildings of the tax office, which were called city gates. Today, the bells and drums in the city were so loud that the tax office was closed. The beggars and common people who were sunbathing outside the city were all driven into the city by the soldiers with weapons like sheep. At this moment, there were no other people on the field outside Chaiyang City except for dozens of ascetic monks. If someone wanted to leave the city, it would be very conspicuous. The dozens of ascetic monks from the Xiankong temple had been waiting outside Chaiyang City for a long time. They did not see Ning Kei and the daughter of Yama, but they saw a horse carriage. The horse carriage was very strange. It was not big, but like Ning Kei's black horse carriage, it was made of stainless steel from the carriage to the wheels. There were many Buddhist mantras written on it. There were 16 horses in front of the carriage. Looking at the exhausted horses and the depth of the wheels in the gravel ground, one could imagine how heavy the horse carriage was. Looking at the slowly approaching horse carriage from afar, the ascetic monks came from the east, west, and the west gates to welcome it. They knelt before the horse carriage and touched their foreheads to the ground, looking very respectful and pious. An old monk wearing a bamboo hat walked out of the carriage with some difficulty. The monk held a monk's staff in his hand, lightly fell to the ground, and the head of the staff made a clear sound of metal clashing. The old monk's staff seemed very soft when it fell to the ground, but the 16 exhausted horses in front of the carriage felt an invisible tremor. One of the horse's limbs went limp and it collapsed. Just as the old monk's feet left the carriage with difficulty, the wheels that were originally deeply embedded in the gravel ground bounced up. Most of the weight of the horse carriage actually came from the old monk himself. Hoofbeats sounded from the direction of Chaoyang City. A general from the military ministry of Yueluan Kingdom personally drove dozens of prepared war horses over. Seeing the old monk standing in front of the horse carriage, the general hurriedly jumped off the horse and knelt on the ground. He kissed the ground in front of the old monk, and his cheeks and lips were soon covered with grass and soil. The officials from the military ministry of Yueluan Kingdom who came with the general untied the ropes in front of the horse carriage as fast as they could and replaced the 16 horses. Then they bowed to the old monk and retreated. Everyone's hands were trembling when they did this. It was unknown whether it was because of excitement or fear. The old monk ignored the general from the Yueluan Kingdom and the officials from the Yueluan Kingdom. He slowly raised his head and looked at the dark clouds above Chaoyang City in the east. The bamboo hat was slightly lifted, and the light shone on the old monk's aged face. The calmness was annihilated in the deep wrinkles, like a clear stream that flowed to the dry yellow soil slope and was instantly sucked dry. The old monk looked at the clouds above Chaoyang City and said calmly, "Along the way, 317 horses died of exhaustion, and countless believers were recruited to build the road. Buddha is merciful, but your disciple has committed so many sins." After saying this, he slowly lifted the monk's staff in his hand and boarded the horse carriage again. When his right foot landed on the carriage, the wheels sank deep into the gravel ground again, and the 16 horses subconsciously neighed. No matter how many sins he had committed and how many commandments he had broken, no one in Buddhism could punish this old monk. Because Buddha had passed away and because he was the chief preaching monk of Shenkong Temple, he was the Buddha in the human world. The old monk always believed that as a disciple of Buddhism, he should be in awe of Buddha's wisdom and Haotian's fate. That was why he came to the human world, to Chaoyang City, even though he had sacrificed so many lives, been stained with so much blood, violated so many commandments and committed so many sins. Because Yama's daughter was in Chaoyang City. Sang Sang was in Chaoyang City on Ning Kei's back. Ning Kei was still running very fast and she was a little shaken. Even though her waist and thighs were tightly connected to Ning Kei's body with ropes, she still felt a little uncomfortable. She did not hug Ning Kei's neck to make her body more stable. Instead, she grabbed Ning Kei's shoulders with both hands and paid attention to her strength. Only in this way would she not affect Ning Kei's running and fighting. Many years ago, when Ning Kei carried her on his back to hunt and escape in Min Mountain, he had tied her on his back with ropes. They were very familiar with this process, so they knew very well what to do. However, Sang Sang was already 16 years old, no longer a little girl. She could still use the same method now, but it was always a little different from before. The sound of bells, drums and gongs were still ringing in the streets of Chaoyang City. More and more residents came out of their homes and poured into the streets. People who had already known the current situation gradually recovered from the previous shock and began to try to find the daughter of Yama under the organization of officials and gentry. Ning Kei and Sang Sang were suddenly in the most dangerous situation. No matter where they ran, they would always be seen. When they ran through the alleys, a woman on the second floor who opened the window to dry clothes would see their backs and then scream loudly. When they ran over the eaves, there would always be idlers and beggars who had nothing to do. They would scream and then be attacked by arrows that he was most afraid of. When he broke into a house and tried to find a place to hide for a while, an old woman who was kneeling in front of a Buddha shrine and murmuring prayers with a frightened expression almost fainted. It would be good if she fainted, but the problem was that the old woman had gained strength from the Buddha statue in the Buddha shrine or from the Buddhist scriptures. She held an incense burner and threw it at Sang Sang, who was behind Ning Quebec. Her face was twisted like a madwoman. Since the West Hill Divine Palace issued the edict, the Buddhism sect no longer tried to cover up the news of the daughter of Yama. Instead, they began to publicize it. After nearly half a year of propaganda, people in the world had long been afraid of the demoness and hated her to the core. What they most wanted to do was to burn Sang Sang alive. Ning Kai carried Sang Sang back to the street again. Unknowingly, the black crows that had stayed in the small courtyard flew over and kept cawing above their heads. It didn't take long for the cultivators and people in Chaoyang City to discover this fact. Countless people looked at the black crows in the sky and listened to their unpleasant cawing. They shouted and chased after them. Ning Kai could no longer hide his whereabouts. Even a short rest time had left him. He could only run on the street with Sang Sang on his back and kept running in the crowd. There were countless screams of horror on the street. Gradually, some people gathered their courage and tried to stop him. Thus, countless bricks, stones, vegetables, eggs, and even rolling pins were picked up and thrown at the street. In the blink of an eye, the street was rained down. Ning Kai avoided the hard objects that were thrown at Sang Sang, but he couldn't avoid the vegetables and eggs that fell like raindrops. His body suddenly became a mess. The corner of his eye was hit by an ink stone. Although it didn't bleed, it was very painful. Sang Sang lowered her head and leaned on his shoulder with her eyes tightly closed. Her pale face and thin body were covered with egg yolk and white. Although she didn't bleed, she still felt very uncomfortable. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 628. When Ning Kai was fleeing with Sang Sang on his back and fighting with the human world, he would kill and was not afraid to kill. People said that his 3 views were not right, but he had always been a person without 3 views. He used to be extremely selfish and cold, no matter how gentle and interesting he looked on the outside, but he had been changed a lot by the academy. However, when he carried Sang Sang on his back, he would become the Ning Kai in Min Mountain, because what he carried was what he valued the most. The appearance of a legendary figure like the chief preaching monk was not the most exciting part of today's update. Because, without spoilers, what I cared about was Ning Kai carrying Sang Sang and fighting with the human world. I was not writing about a hero at the end of his life. It was Sulu. I was writing about 2 people who were regarded as demons by the human world, and they might really be demons. Because they did not want to die, they ran wildly and killed people intentionally or unintentionally. That was why when Sulu was fleeing he was covered with scars, but his heart was firm and he believed that he was right. But when Ning Kai fled with Sang Sang on his back, I felt much sadder. Ning Kai was fine because he was a cold person and he learned to be generous in the academy. The problem was that Sang Sang was on Ning Kai's back on the street at that time, and I, as a fan of Sang Sang, was so sad. I had planned to ask for the monthly votes after a few words, but I ended up writing more. Yesterday's monthly votes were very helpful, thank you very much. Although I was not born in Brother Pao's family, I would not be a sloppy person. Subjectively, I could not say how good the writing was, but objectively, I would work harder. Sang Sang was on Ning Kai's back, but in fact, everyone had a Sang Sang on their back. Some carried their studies, some carried their families, some carried their lovers, some carried their children, and some carried their desires. As long as it was what you cared about the most, you would work hard for it. Although I had tried several times to carry someone on my back, I did not succeed. This month, the powerful blood-red classmate is staring at our backs. What I have on my back now is the glory of being the first in the monthly votes, or rather, my favorite vanity. So, I will continue to work hard and protect the things on my back with all my might, completely doing my best. On my back was the champion of the annual monthly votes. With everyone's enthusiastic help, we've already shortened the distance between us and wind chimes. Of course, he will definitely try to shake me off again, and I don't want to be shaken off. I want to catch up to him. I hope to be able to close the distance between us to within 1,000 votes or even less this month. Of course, who wouldn't want to surpass him? Then in December we can fight to our heart's content. Please take a look at your account number. If you still have more, please vote for Jiang Yi. If Jiang Yi has already cast 5 votes, then with deep gratitude, please see if you are willing to vote for Spy, Qing Yunyan, or Vermilion Bird Chronicles. These are also included in the total number of votes. Thank you. Thank you very much. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 629. Chaoyang City was shrouded in clouds. It was cold and not quiet. The sound of bells and gongs was mixed with screams and angry curses. The streets were crowded with people and debris was flying everywhere. Ning Kai carried Sang Sang on his back and continued running in the rain of rotten vegetables, eggs and bricks. So this is how the battle with the human world looks like. He thought silently and held the hilt tightly with both hands. Looking at the increasingly dense crowd on the street, he gasped and asked, "Do you feel sad?" He ran hard and breathed quickly, so his voice was slightly trembling and not very loud. It was hard to hear him clearly on the street full of sirens, curses and screams. Sang Sang leaned on his shoulder and heard him clearly. She opened her eyes and looked at the frightened and hateful people on both sides of the street. Her pale face was slightly sad and she hummed. Ning Kai smiled and said, "Those who are sad because of others are good people. We are bad people, so we should be aware of ourselves. We can't be sad." Seeing that the vegetables, eggs, bricks and inkstones couldn't stop the two people on the street, the people of Chaoyang City became more and more angry. Some people even plucked up the courage to stop them. A strong man with a chest full of black hair and unbuttoned clothes ran out of a tea shop in front of them. He roared and opened his arms to hug Ning Kai in the shrill cheers and cheers of the neighbors. Ning Kai didn't stop at all and just bumped into him. With a light sound, the strong man was hit diagonally and fell to the ground like a kite. No one knew how many bones were broken. Ning Kai's speed was not affected by the collision with the strong man, and his expression didn't change. He stepped on the street and continued to run to somewhere in North City. The neighbors gathered around the strong man and found that this man, who used to bully the kind people with his strength but bravely stood up for justice today, was exhaling more than he inhaled. They couldn't help but exclaim and looked at Ning Kai, who had run far away. They stamped their feet and cursed with grief and indignation. The servant of the daughter of Yama was so cruel and cold-blooded. As soon as he turned a corner, Ning Kai saw another 8 or 9 men, led by a village official, blocking the middle of the street with thick straw ropes. They kept shouting to boost their courage. Moderate fear could easily arouse people's anger and courage. In order to catch Sang Sang, many lazy men in Chaoyang City were willing to pay the price of being injured and wanted to be heroes from the people. Ning Kai understood this. He had seen lions being besieged by bulls in the wilderness and knew that he couldn't be soft-hearted at this time. Instead, he had to be cold-blooded and tough in order to intimidate the usually docile but extremely crazy ordinary people. Therefore, he didn't hesitate and directly rushed over with no expression on his face. With a series of crisp sounds, those brave men fell with bones all over their bodies and blood, making the scene extremely bloody. As expected, seeing such a cruel scene and thinking of the legend of the daughter of Yama, the people who had been cursing Sang Sang and Ning Kai with the dirtiest language subconsciously covered their mouths and no one dared to throw things into the street. However, Ning Kai ran too fast for what happened on the street to reach the people in front of him. More and more Chaoyang City residents stood up bravely and tried to stop him and Sang Sang. There were more and more people on the street and many of them were holding things like iron forks in their hands. It became more dangerous. Ning Kai kept dodging and finally rushed out of the block. Then he saw what he was most afraid of. Several rows of archers from the Yueluan kingdom were aiming at him from behind a grain bag in front of a mansion. On the side walls on both sides of the street, there were also many archers. "Shoot!" An extremely stern voice sounded out of nowhere. Countless shrill sounds broke through the air and hundreds of arrows shot at the two people in the middle of the street like a rainstorm. Ning Kai could jump onto the eaves to dodge or choose other methods. However, his speed would be affected and he would probably be surrounded by the powerful cultivators from the Buddhism and Taoism sects. Therefore he just shouted, "Open!" Sang Sang opened the big black umbrella. Although there were many holes on the umbrella, it still created a strong resistance when the wind blew. Her body shook a little and if she was not tied up by the rope she would probably fall off Ning Kai's back. Most of the arrows were shot at Sang Sang on Ning Kai's back. It seemed that the Yueluan kingdom's military had already learned of the weakness of the daughter of Yama from the Buddhism sect. They were especially tough and wanted to kill her in one shot. The rainstorm of arrows fell with a frightening sound. The sharp and hard arrowheads deeply pierced into the walls on both sides of the street or the ground, leaving clear marks on the bluestone floor. However, what made the archers feel confused and panicked was that after the arrows hit the big black umbrella, they could not penetrate it at all and were bounced out. They thought in shock, is this umbrella made of iron? The big black umbrella could cover Sang Sang's thin body, but it could not completely cover Ning Kai, especially when dozens of arrows were shot from the front. However, with the strength of his body after cultivating the Great Spirit, as long as it was not the archers who could use heavy bows, he could not be threatened at all. Therefore, except for a few arrows that were about to fly past his face and hit his back, he did not make any dodging movements and continued to rush forward. An arrow shot into Ning Kei's chest and then broke off and bounced off. Another arrow shot into his throat, leaving a tiny wound. It was as if the skin had been scraped off, and not even a trace of blood could be seen. The Ueluan Kingdom's archers, who were shocked by the big black umbrella, were even more shocked when they saw this scene. They thought, is this person's body also made of iron? Especially the dozens of archers behind the grain bags in front of the mansion. Seeing Ning Kei running like the wind and getting closer and closer, they were so frightened that they could not even hold their bows. Under the clouds, a dozen black crows cawed from time to time above the street. Under the black crows, Ning Kei was running with Sang Sang on his back. Although no one could stop him or even delay him for a moment, he could not get rid of the encirclement of the soldiers and civilians in Chaoyang City. No matter how fast he could not be faster than hundreds of thousands of eyes. In particular, the black crows flying above him and Sang Sang were like guiding lights, pointing the way for the soldiers and civilians in Chaoyang City. No matter where he ran, he would instantly fall into the sea of anger of the people. He was even almost surrounded by the ascetic monks of the Buddhism sect twice. The angry people and cultivators blocked Ning Kei and Sang Sang into a smaller and smaller area. The black crows flew above the street to the palace in North City, cawing more and more harshly. The people followed the black crows in the sky to the palace. The cultivators of the Buddhism sect and the Taoism sect also gathered there, ready to end this noisy and tense story there. That's all for today. First, I need to reorganize the later plot. Although I have been organizing it from time to time, this kind of key plot is always needed during the period when my brain is like paste. After midnight, all the key plots are needed, so I need to reorganize the plot more frequently than before. Second, Feng Linger has said that she is going to fight. Today I need to adjust my mind and body and then I will have a good fight. Tomorrow is Saturday, but I have already taken a vacation before, so I will not rest. For chapters are guaranteed. I'm going to work on the plot now. Have a good weekend, everyone. Have fun watching and reading tomorrow. I will fight for you. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 630. Countless residents of Chaoyang City swarmed around the palace. Looking at the solemn palace and the armored soldiers in front of the palace, the awe deeply rooted in their bones gradually calmed down and stopped moving forward. However, there were too many people. Looking down from the palace walls, it seemed that half of Chaoyang City was soaked in dirty water with fallen leaves. The atmosphere was tense and violent. Thousands of sergeants and hundreds of archers formed several lines of defense in front of the crowd to maintain order. More than 100 ascetic monks and more than a dozen Westhill divine guards looked at the sky with vigilance. No one knew when, but 3 old priests in red from Westhill slowly walked out of the palace, looking solemn. Tens of thousands of people present had chased a dozen black crows here, but they had lost track of the black crows. They could not help but feel anxious and looked up at the sky, looking around for the black lines. They wanted to hear the unpleasant cawing, which looked like countless geese looking up to be fed. Someone looked to the southwest of the palace, where the White Tower temple was shrouded in light, and suddenly found the black crows hovering in the air behind the White Tower. He could not help but cry out. Over there. The daughter of Yama dared to enter the White Tower temple. Was she not afraid of death? Tens of thousands of people in front of the palace were discussing and cursing the demonists for daring to disrespect Buddha. Gradually they became fanatical and angry again. They waved their fists and ran toward the White Tower temple in a mess. More than 1,000 sergeants and cultivators did not intend to stop the angry people. Instead, they were pushed by the crowd to the White Tower temple. Sometime before, Ning Kei ran to the temple wall without slowing down. He tiptoed on a slightly protruding brick on the wall and jumped into the air. He stretched out his hand to hold the wall, bent his waist and abdomen, and jumped onto the top of the wall. The wall of the White Tower temple was nearly 20 feet high. Ordinary people could not climb over it, but it was not a difficult obstacle for him. Standing on the high walls of the temple, he turned around and looked behind him. He found that the angry crowd had yet to chase after him, and there was no sign of the ascetic monks. He relaxed a little and looked up at the black crows flying in the sky. His expression turned cold. Those black crows seemed to be able to sense his anxiety, anger, and undisguised killing intent. They cawed a few times, flapped their black wings, flew higher into the sky, and then circled around. Ning Kei jumped off the temple wall and landed on the ground, bending his knees to absorb most of the impact. He looked back at Sang Sang's pale face and asked worriedly, "Are you all right?" Sang Sang felt very uncomfortable, but she shook her head. During the winter in Chaiyang City, Ning Ke had brought Sang Sang to the White Tower Temple to study Buddhism 3 times. He had been here more often than not, so he was very familiar with the layout and architecture of the temple. He ran through the quiet temple garden at a high speed and soon passed the side hall, entering the relatively quiet back temple, and then ran to the White Tower not far away. The bell in the White Tower Temple was still echoing with the bells in other temples in the city. The powerful monks in the temple had already left the temple to search for the daughter of Yama. Who would have thought that Ning Ke would dare to bring Sang Sang here? Moreover, the black crows were flying high at this time, so no one had discovered them yet. The Ueluan Kingdom was a Buddhist country. There was a saying that there were 300 temples in Misty Rain, and 72 temples in Misty Rain. But no matter what the saying was, the White Tower Temple in Chaiyang City would always be the first temple in the Buddhist country. This temple had a very long history, only a little later than the Lank Temple on Hua Mountain. But like the Lank Temple, it was also the front gate of the Shenkong Temple in the world. No one knew how many eminent monks had appeared here. The White Tower also had a very high status in the cultivation world. The senior Kuni Madi had shaved her hair in this temple. It was said that the abbot of the White Tower Temple was also an eminent monk who had achieved enlightenment and had a cultivation similar to the knowing destiny state. The most famous thing in this temple was of course the White Tower. Just like the legend of the Hua Mountain chess game in the Lank Temple, this place had a White Tower before it had a Buddhist temple. Looking at the White Pagoda and the lake, Ning Ke suddenly felt a little uneasy. He had brought Sang Sang to the White Tower Temple 3 times, and he had secretly come here a few times, but he had never been close to the White Pagoda. But the place he planned to go was under the White Tower, and he was really suffering from being chased by the people in the city. If he did not find a place to rest for a while, he was very worried that he would die of exhaustion. There was a small lake behind the White Tower Temple. There was a small island in the lake and the White Tower was on the island. On the island in the middle of the lake, there was a very inconspicuous temple. The island was connected to the lakeside by a narrow bridge. It was the end of winter and the beginning of spring, so the lake was not frozen. A few withered lotus branches stretched over the narrow bridge, giving it a natural beauty. Caw-caw. The unpleasant cry of the black crow came from the air. Ning Ke dashed out from behind an ancient bell with Sang Sang on his back. He ran along the lake to the narrow bridge and rushed to the island on the other side of the bridge. More than a dozen monks walked out of the meditation room, pointing at the black crow flying in the air and discussing in shock. Then they saw Ning Ke on the bridge and could not help but shout in shock. Inside the White Tower Temple, there were suddenly countless footsteps. Listening to the shouting of these monks, many people shouted and cursed as they chased to the lake in the back of the temple. Ning Ke knew that he had alarmed the monks in the temple and had been discovered again. He continued to run on the narrow bridge, his feet stepping on the withered lotus branches, and his right hand had already grasped the hilt of his padao. He ran across the narrow bridge and as soon as he got out of the bridge, he tightened his grip on the hilt of his saber. He unsheathed his padao and slashed forward with a cold glint. With 2 banging sounds, the 2 iron staffs were sent flying into the air. There were 2 ascetic monks from the White Tower Temple who had been hiding at the bridge after hearing the shouts, intending to sneak attack Ning Quebec. They did not expect that Ning Ke had already known their position and attacked first. 2 extremely deep cuts appeared on the bodies of the ascetic monks, from their faces to their waists. Blood spurted wildly and they looked extremely miserable. They immediately fell to the ground and died. Ning Ke did not even look at the 2 ascetic monks. Without pausing, he held the padao and continued to run forward. He broke through the wooden door and broke into the quiet and simple nunnery on the island in the middle of the lake. The windows of the nunnery were covered with a thick veil, and it was dark inside. Suddenly, an extremely sharp sound broke through the air. The chi of heaven and earth in the nunnery suddenly condensed, and an iron staff carrying the condensed chi of heaven and earth smashed towards Ning Ke's head. Using the staff to attract the chi of heaven and earth was so frightening. This person's state was extremely strong, and his psyche power was extremely strong. Moreover, the timing of his attack was extremely ruthless. Even with Ning Ke's ability, it was difficult for him to deal with it if he was caught off guard. However, Ning Ke had long known who was in the nunnery, and that was why he had broken into the nunnery. How could he not be prepared? The padao in his hand swung upwards and heavily struck the iron staff. The first step of the long march. Today's first chapter. Try to finish the next chapter before 10 o'clock. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 631. Earlier at the bridge, when Ning Kei's Padao met with the two ascetic monks' iron staffs, there was a heavy sound of impact. Then the other party's iron staffs were shaken off, and Ning Kei killed them with 2 strokes. At this time in the nunnery, when the Padao in his hand met with the iron staff that was whistling through the air, there was a slight sound, like a brush being burned by the flame of an oil lamp. The reason for this was that the cultivation of the person holding the staff was far higher than that of the ascetic monks at the bridge. The iron staff carried the chi of heaven and earth, so it was very fast and stable. Correspondingly, Ning Kei's upward Padao was more fierce, so when the two met, the iron staff was not sent flying, but directly broke in the middle. With a swoosh, the iron staff was broken into 2 pieces. The upper half of the iron staff flew past Ning Kei's shoulder, smashing a big hole in the painted roof of the nunnery. The lower half, which had been sharpened by the Padao, was held in the person's hand and continued to stab Ning Kei's lower abdomen. With a shrill and bitter cry, the person slapped towards Ning Kei's face. Ning Kei could clearly feel the strong aura of Buddhism on the person's left hand, and he had already sensed that the iron staff that had smashed through the roof was flying back at high speed. At this time, there was a sharp iron staff in front of his lower abdomen, and another iron staff was about to attack his back. In addition to that withered old hand, he was facing 3 enemies, which was very dangerous. But he did not panic. Master Yensei had once told him the words of Liu Bai, the sage of sword: a sword can travel thousands of miles, but not even a foot in front of you. Ning Kei, who had started cultivation halfway, was like Yi Hongyu. He knew very well how to defeat these seemingly strong cultivators, and what a real battle was. At this time, the Padao's upward momentum had not ended, and it could not return to the front. The 2 iron staffs attacked from the front and back, and the withered hand had arrived. Ning Kei did not hesitate to let go of the hilt in his right hand, and his left hand reached out like lightning, slapping away the half-iron staff that was stabbing towards his lower abdomen. Then he stepped forward and accurately punched the person's face. With 2 crisp sounds, Ning Kei retracted his body. His right hand grabbed the air and once again held the Padao that had yet to fall. Then, with another 2 sounds, the 2 iron staffs fell to the ground one after another. The man cried out miserably and retreated while covering his face. He had already withdrawn his left hand that was aimed at Ning Quebec. No matter how miraculous the cultivation method was, it still needed to be controlled by the person. As long as the person was defeated, how could the cultivation method continue to be used? However, the battle was not over yet. The thick muslin outside the nunnery window suddenly floated up, and then broke into pieces, splitting into countless plain-colored flowers. Because the muslin curtain was extremely thick, those flower braids also seemed a bit plump, but they gave off a suffocating feeling, giving off a strong feeling that if these muslin flowers covered one's face, it would be difficult for one to breathe. The Padao in Ning Kei's right hand trembled in the air at a high speed, like countless bolts of lightning, easily smashing the muslin flowers. Then, he leaped lightly and swept into the depths of the nunnery. There was a Buddha statue in the depths of the nunnery. In front of the Buddha statue there was an incense burner, a bell and 2 futons. On one of the futons sat a young girl with her back facing the door of the nunnery. On the other futon sat an old woman who was vomiting blood. She was the one who had sneak attacked Ning Kei with the iron staff and was defeated by Ning Kei with 1 punch. The blade broke through the air and landed lightly on the young girl's neck. Ning Kei looked at the young girl's back and said without any emotion on his face, "You too, long time no see." The old woman supported herself on the ground and climbed up with difficulty. She sat on the futon and stared at Ning Kei with hatred. She said, "If you want to meet, why not in the underworld?" The old woman's face was full of wrinkles and her expression was naturally mean. Although her gaze was filled with hatred, one could see a faint despair in the depths of her eyes. It was Aunt Cuny Matty. The young girl on the futon turned around. Her slightly pale face was still as charming as a flower, but her expression was very cold and numb. Her black hair was tied up in her hat and she looked like a nun who was focused on cultivating. She was the flower addict, Lu Qinjia. In the late autumn of the 16th year of Tianqi era, there was a great battle in the Lang Temple. The president of the commandment yard of the Shenkong Temple, Master Bushu, died on the spot. Cuny Matty could not rest in peace. Thinking of Daosher's death, she was even more disheartened. After returning to the kingdom, she asked the Yueluan kingdom for this nunnery in the White Tower Temple to cultivate and gradually became a dead person. The flower addict, Wuxia, had experienced many changes and was also in despair. She gradually lost her love and followed her aunt to live in seclusion in the nunnery, eating vegetarian food and chanting scriptures in front of the Buddha statue. Just like that, the two most famous and highest-ranking women in the Yueluan kingdom cut off all worldly affairs and only sought peace in the nunnery. They lived peacefully for a year and no longer had any contact with the outside world. They did not know that Ning Kai and Sang Sang were still alive, nor did they know that they had come to Chaiyang City. Even the bell that rang throughout the city did not make them react. It was not until Ning Kai came to the White Tower Temple, walked on the narrow bridge and killed the two ascetic monks that they came to their senses. I did not expect you to still be alive and to come to the Yueluan kingdom. Cuny Madi wiped the blood off her lips and stared at Ning Kai's face with hatred. She suddenly understood and laughed crazily. It seems that you and the daughter of Yama are being chased very badly. This is really something to be happy about. This aunt, who had a high status in the Buddhism sect, had indeed spent the past year as tranquil as still water, even as dead ashes. However, hatred was the most powerful force in the world. At this time, when she saw Ning Kai, whom she hated the most, appear in front of her, her expression suddenly became lively, and endless hatred was born. Wuxia did not expect Ning Kai and Sang Sang to still be alive. Looking at Sang Sang on Ning Kai's back, her indifferent expression, which was like a petal in ice, moved slightly. Her eyes were filled with mixed emotions and she looked very lost. Ning Kai looked at the two of them and did not speak. There was no need to speak now. The extremely powerful and terrifying aura outside the West City Gate forced him to turn back. The residents of Chaiyang City and the powerful cultivators from the Buddhism and Taoism sects had chased him until he had nowhere to run. That was why he came to the nunnery to rest temporarily and wait for the change that he had been waiting for. Cuny Madi and Wuxia were just his hostages. He came to the White Tower Temple to study Buddhism and read scriptures in the winter. When he secretly investigated the environment of the temple, he noticed that there was something wrong with the lake at the back of the temple. Even though he could not get close, he saw an ascetic monk with an iron staff frequently entering and leaving the island. Back in the wilderness, he had seen the ascetic monk and knew that he was Cuny Madi and Wuxia's bodyguard. After that, he observed several times and basically confirmed that Cuny Madi and Wuxia were living in seclusion in this nunnery. The unpleasant cawing of crows sounded outside the nunnery. Ning Kai took out a rope made of tough cowhide and tied Cuny Madi and Wuxia tightly. Then he carried them to the curtain and looked out through the petal-shaped holes in the curtain. He saw the black crows circling in the air. At the end of autumn last year, when Ning Kai and Sang Sang moved into the small courtyard, a black crow flew over and perched on a branch. For the next 10 days, a black crow flew over every day. It was strange and made him very uneasy. However, after that, both parties got along well and he gradually stopped caring about it. Who would have thought that these black crows would become his and Sang Sang's greatest enemy today? If not for these black crows in Chaiyang City, he might have hidden with Sang Sang or even escaped. Ning Kai did not understand why these black crows would appear in the small courtyard and why they were following him today. The biggest possibility was naturally the aura of Yama on Sang Sang. However, if the black crows represented misfortune, shouldn't he help Sang Sang? Why did he use this method to expose Sang Sang's location? No matter what the reason was, he had to kill these black crows. Otherwise, no matter how powerful he was, even if the change he had been waiting for had finally come, he and Sang Sang would still walk into a dead end in the end. Previously, when they were escaping, he had wanted to kill these crows. However, he did not have the time and could not free himself to do so. His right hand landed on the windowsill and used a little strength to break a piece of window wood. Then he crushed it into a dozen pieces. He silently activated the Great Spirit and threw it at the black crows in the sky. The light window wood shards contained the Great Spirit and instantly turned into hard stones. They flew through the air with a terrifying momentum. The black crows did not have time to react and were hit heavily. There were only a few screams as their black feathers fell and the crows fell to the ground. Ning Kai felt slightly relieved. However, what shocked him was that after a while, the unpleasant sounds of crows rang out again around the nunnery. The black crows appeared under the clouds again. Could it be that these black crows could not be killed? There were more and more people in the White Tower Temple. Especially on the shore of the lake behind the temple, there was a dense crowd. Some people were even squeezed into the lake. Countless archers and crossbows appeared around the narrow bridge. More than 100 Buddhism sect disciples and more than a dozen divine guards were vigilantly watching the nunnery on the island in the middle of the lake. Looking from the window of the nunnery to the shore, one could see hundreds of people at a glance. Ning Ke knew that there were far more people. There were thousands or even tens of thousands of people behind them. Those people could not wait to rush into the nunnery, bite off his and Sang Sang's flesh bit by bit, and then burn them with fire. He could not help but frown. I really don't understand why you are so stupid to hide in this place of death. Cuny Maddie looked at his back with a mean and sarcastic expression on her face. She said in a hoarse voice, "Do you think that by taking the two of us as hostages, you can let the daughter of Yama go? You are really too naive." Ning Ke did not look back and said, "Your voice is very unpleasant, just like those crows in the sky. If you want to see how Sang Sang and I will be torn to pieces, I suggest you shut up now." Cuny Maddie laughed and looked very happy. She really wanted to see how Ning Ke and Sang Sang would die, so she chose to shut up for now. In the palace not far from the White Tower Temple, the king of Yueluan Kingdom looked at the person covered in blood on the stretcher in front of him. He waved his arms and said sternly, "Commander, do you understand what your decision means? There are two of my closest relatives in the nunnery. If you want to attack by force, it is very likely that they will die under the attack of mutual destruction." The commander of the West Hill Divine Palace Divine Guards, Luo Kadi, lay weakly on the stretcher. His throat was wrapped in a thick gauze and he could not speak at all. However, his eyes were still so stern and strong. Master Chi Mei stood beside the stretcher and put his palms together to salute the king of Yueluan Kingdom. He said, "Your Majesty, please understand the current situation. Why did the Buddhist and Taoist sects pay such a high price? Since Ning Ke has brought the daughter of Yama into the land of death, we should seize this opportunity." Luo Kadi still could not speak. He could only snort coldly through his nose. Chi Mei said slowly, "In order to save the world, I think everyone is willing to sacrifice their lives. The people of Chaiyang City are all so brave. How can Aunt Chu and Princess Jinjia be cowards?" The king of Yueluan Kingdom's face became extremely gloomy. He clenched his fists and his eyes began to flicker with uneasiness. He seemed to be struggling and hesitating. The Yueluan Kingdom was a Buddhist kingdom and was deeply influenced by the Buddhism sect. It could even be said that it was directly controlled by them. The West Hill Divine Palace was undoubtedly the most terrifying existence in the world. At this moment, both the Buddhism sect and Taoism sect had expressed their stance. No matter how tough he was, he had no power to stop this terrible thing from happening. The king of Yueluan Kingdom took a deep breath and said slowly, "If that's the case, why not wait a little longer?" In the quiet imperial palace, someone suddenly said something. The person who suddenly spoke up and stopped the king of Yueluan Kingdom from making a decision was someone no one expected. It was not the prime minister of Yueluan Kingdom, nor was it the empress who loved her daughter. It was an old priest in red. He was one of the 3 priests in red who had left the palace earlier. No one knew when he had returned. The priest in red said calmly, "Heaven has the virtue of cherishing life. Since Ning Ke and the daughter of Yama have already entered the land of death, why are you in such a hurry?" Luo Kadi, who was lying on the stretcher, was furious when he heard this. He pointed at the priest in red and trembled in anger. However, he could not speak. The other 2 priests in red walked forward and completely ignored Luo Kadi's shocked and doubtful gaze. They looked at the crowd and said expressionlessly, "We have the same opinion. Heaven has the virtue of cherishing life." Chi Mei's expression changed. He could not understand why these priests from the West Hill Divine Palace would say such a thing. Heaven has the virtue of cherishing life? When did Haoyan Taoism become so gentle and compassionate? These priests in red from the West Hill Divine Palace had arrived at Peach Mountain a few days ago. They had the decree of the Hierarch Lord and the Great Divine Priest of Revelation. Therefore no one suspected them. It was said that these 3 priests in red were all proficient in divine skills. The West Hill Divine Palace was worried that the people of Chaiyang City would suffer heavy casualties, so they specially sent them. Luo Kadi's pupils suddenly shrank as he thought of a possibility. Almost at the same time, Chi Mei thought of it too. He frowned slightly and looked at the 3 priests in red. He asked, "Which divine hall are you from?" The old priest in red calmly said, "The Divine Hall of Light. That's the 2nd chapter. Try to finish the 3rd chapter before midnight." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.